Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Let's begin with Story 1. The Eagle's Nest of Tyrol, Life in Schloss Ambras. The castle above Innsbruck. High in the rolling alpine slopes of Tyrol, where Austria meets the sky, sits a structure built not for glamour or glory but for quiet dignity and protection. Schloss Ambras, nestled above the city of Innsbruck, is often overlooked in favor of grander, more imposing castles. But its story is one of resilience, solitude, and the everyday decisions that shape the world below. It was not built as a fortress to repel sieges, nor as a crown jewel for imperial power. Instead, Schloss Ambras began its quiet existence in the 10th century as a strategic seat of local counts, watching the passes below like a shepherd watches his flocks. From this height, those inside could see the bends of the Inn River, the caravans, the snow patterns, and perhaps even read the winds of change drifting from the Habsburg lands. As you imagine yourself there, perhaps in a cold stone room, the fog hugging the walls outside, it is not war or conquest you hear. It is the creak of wooden floors, the muffled sound of a mountain storm, and the quiet shuffle of a servant carrying wood for warmth. Because in Ambras, like many mountain castles, survival came not from swords but from schedules. Daily life in the clouds. It might surprise you to learn that the rhythm of life in a high-altitude castle was mostly defined by boredom. At over 600 meters above sea level, Schloss Ambras wasn't cut off, but it wasn't easy to reach either. Snow, fog, and impassable slopes made supply chains unreliable. As a result, its inhabitants lived in a state of constant preparation. Winter meant salting meat and stacking firewood. Spring meant repairing storm damage and checking for cracks in the stonework caused by freeze-thaw cycles. Summer was for receiving guests, often merchants or minor nobles climbing the steep switchbacks. Autumn, that was for stock-taking, the most important season of all. You might wonder, how does a castle survive when it can't always rely on the land below? The answer lies in the inventory ledgers that still survive today. These are the boring artifacts of history, the ones that speak volumes. In one such record from 1567, the court steward notes quantities of flour, wine, candles, linens, and curiously, musical instruments. Why music in such a remote place? Because boredom is dangerous. A restless noble could become political. An idle soldier could become a problem. And so, within these fog-laced halls, the sounds of lutes and clavichords often filled the air not for celebration, but for maintenance of mood. Ferdinand II, the collector in the mountains. Perhaps the most famous resident of Schloss Ambras was Archduke Ferdinand II of Austria, a man not particularly fond of court life in Vienna. In the 1570s, he made Ambras his personal retreat, not a place to escape power, but a place to redefine it. Ferdinand was a collector of curiosities, and under his watch, the castle transformed into one of Europe's first Kunstkammer, a cabinet of wonders. The great irony: these treasures, unicorn horns, armors of giants, paintings of wild men, were brought up the treacherous mountain paths by mule and man, just so they could be hidden in the fog. Why? Ferdinand believed that knowledge, like wine, fermented better in solitude. One of his collections included over 200 portraits of famous figures, not for flattery but for study. He wished to understand how faces revealed ambition, sickness, or deceit. In this quiet mountain castle, he would stare for hours, not at landscapes but at the lined faces of generals, queens, and merchants. Boring, perhaps, but his obsession with cataloging human nature would later influence court artists and even early psychologists. Ambras became a place where silence bred insight, where altitude gave perspective not only over the land but over the human condition. Wind, water, and waste. Living above the clouds had consequences, mundane, unpleasant ones. Water had to be managed with care. Cisterns collected rain, and runoff from snow was filtered into stone basins. In dry months, A shortage could force even nobles to ration washing. Waste was another matter. Latrines, called guardrobes, emptied into stone chutes hanging precariously off outer walls, often onto steep slopes where gravity did the rest. Cleaning them was a dangerous and dreaded job. The winds sometimes blew back in unexpected ways. One 1602 record mentions a guard who resigned after a strong gust caused a rather unfortunate incident near the South Tower. Even heating the castle was a relentless struggle. Fireplaces roared constantly, but high ceilings and stone walls meant heat was more suggestion than reality. Residents wore multiple layers indoors. Foot warmers and hot stones wrapped in cloth became the norm. Candle making, too, was a year-round necessity, a quiet, smelly art involving tallow, patience, and a steady hand. The social order of solitude. In a city, hierarchy is visible, the lord in his palace, the merchant on the street, the servant in the alley. But in a mountain castle, proximity defined power. The closer one slept to the main hearth, the higher their status. Rooms were not assigned just by title but by insulation. Ferdinand's quarters, naturally, were the warmest. His trusted steward, close by, servants and guards, closer to the edge where the stones remained cold even in summer. The castle was a social map written in heat loss and draft patterns. Outside, shepherds and tenant farmers toiled on treacherous slopes, sending up cheese, wool, and firewood. They were rarely allowed inside. Only during blizzards or for special summons would a farmer enter Ambras, often wide-eyed and overwhelmed by the tapestries and polished armor. A castle meant for reflection. Unlike mountain fortresses like Hohensalzburg or Hohenwerfen built for defense, Schloss Ambras was built to observe. From its windows, one could see the roads winding toward Italy and Bavaria. Trade caravans appeared as dots, their arrival announced by dust plumes far below. Ferdinand kept a telescope long before they were common. He noted troop movements, snow levels, and weather changes not for paranoia, but for planning. The castle became a weather station, war room, and philosopher's cell all in one. And perhaps that is what defines Ambras best, not its stone, but its stillness. It was never famous for withstanding sieges, but it endured something harder, irrelevance. It survived because it embraced slowness, quiet, and the dull but vital rhythms of high-altitude life. Unresolved thought. As the wind howled outside and candles flickered in the long corridors, one might wonder, what kind of man chooses a mountain not to rule but to think? And what secrets were whispered into the fog, never written, never known, except by the walls? A palace of objects and obsession. As the 16th century progressed, Schloss Ambras became something more than a quiet retreat. Under the gaze of Archduke Ferdinand II, it evolved into one of the most significant cultural archives in Europe, hidden behind clouds, walls, and winter. To live above the clouds is to wrest control from the world below, not with armies, but with memory. Ferdinand understood this. He saw the chaotic tides of war, reformation, and dynastic intrigue that surged across the Holy Roman Empire, and chose instead to invest in preservation. Within the thick limestone walls of the upper castle, rooms were repurposed into thematic collections. One room was filled with portraits, another with military armor, including the suits of men over 7 feet tall, claimed to be giants. One held curious instruments, a globe that could open, automata, and early telescopes. Perhaps the most fascinating was the collection of portraits of the freaks of nature, people with rare physical conditions who had, one way or another, become part of court culture in early modern Europe. To modern sensibilities, such collections may feel distasteful, but in Ferdinand's era, this was a scientific pursuit, an attempt to categorize all of God's creation, especially the exceptional. By documenting the unusual, he believed, the usual could be better understood. The practical challenge of collecting at altitude. Every item in Ferdinand's Kunstkammer had to be hauled up the mountain. There were no railroads or trucks, only oxen, mules, sleds, and men. Fragile items were wrapped in wool or straw. Oil paintings had to be varnished carefully to survive the cold, dry air. Instruments needed to be retuned constantly due to the fluctuating pressure and humidity. Glass would crack, wood would warp, scrolls would expand and contract, but still the items came. Why go through the trouble? Ferdinand could have collected in Vienna, but the solitude of Ambras offered something else: control. In the capital, politics tainted everything. But at Ambras, he could curate without interference. He could decide what was worth preserving and what was not. In a way, this was an early form of museum philosophy, a belief that location shapes interpretation and that quiet lends dignity to objects. Hidden in the halls, the story of Philippine Welser. No account of Schloss Ambras is complete without mentioning Philippine Welser, Ferdinand's wife, and one of the most controversial figures of her time. She was not royalty. She was a bourgeois woman from Augsburg, the daughter of a wealthy merchant family. In 1557, Ferdinand married her in secret. Their marriage was morganatic, meaning she would never be queen, and their children could not inherit the archduke's titles. Their love was real, but their station was forbidden. They were exiled, in a sense, to the mountains. And yet, it was in Ambras that they built a life, away from court scrutiny. Philippine brought with her an extraordinary range of knowledge. She was skilled in herbal medicine and maintained one of the earliest documented recipe books for home remedies, now kept in the Austrian National Library. She also introduced furnishing styles and domestic layouts that made Ambras unusually comfortable by noble standards. She had hot baths constructed, with tiled floors and running water piped via gravity. Her rooms were adorned not just with tapestries, but with flowers and domestic art, things considered common but deeply humanizing. In the silence of Ambras, she and Ferdinand found not exile but intimacy. Their letters to each other are filled with references to the view from the castle, the movement of deer in the forest, and the mood of the fog, rarely political, often mundane, and yet deeply revealing. For them, the castle above the clouds was not a prison. It was a place where they could live small, despite the largeness of their names. Of science in the sky. Living at elevation also brought unique opportunities to observe natural phenomena, many of which puzzled Renaissance minds. Ferdinand and his court scholars studied atmospheric halos caused by ice crystals refracting light. They kept meticulous notes on weather anomalies, particularly thunder in winter and snow in summer. Such records became useful later, during the Little Ice Age, when mountain dwellers had to adapt to unpredictable cold spells and crop failures. One steward's record from 1583 notes that the wine froze in the cellar, and the candle wax had to be softened by fire before use. These moments, though boring, were history in motion. They reflect a Europe that was cooling, a population struggling to adapt, and a nobility learning the limits of luxury. The elevation also gave the Ambras court early views of the stars, long before urban light pollution dulled the heavens. On clear nights, Philippine and Ferdinand observed the movements of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the occasional comet, charted with ink and compass on vellum scrolls now yellowed with time. Diplomacy at the edge. Despite its isolation, Ambras was not irrelevant. It served as a quiet meeting place for Ferdinand's trusted agents, foreign scholars, and minor nobles, whose allegiance mattered more than their rank. The castle was deliberately underdefended, an architectural message that it was not a threat, only a retreat. This made it perfect for discreet diplomacy. Letters were exchanged, private agreements were made, quiet pressures were applied. Ambras was where problems were cooled before they became threats. The high air and long meals smoothed tempers. Many disputes between Tyrolean counts, Bavarian traders, and imperial officials were resolved not with proclamations, but with pastries in Ambras's banquet hall. A letter from a visiting Venetian ambassador in 1576 complains of being snowed in for 8 days, but goes on to praise the hospitality and the discussions had during that time. It seems isolation had a softening effect. It slowed time, allowing decisions to be less reactionary. The sounds of Ambras. What did a day in Ambras sound like? Not silence, but a layered quietude. In the mornings, the lowing of cattle, the clatter of kitchen pots, and the dull thump of firewood against stone. The court organ, a small portable model, might sound off for morning prayers. Midday brought more activity. The ring of blacksmith tools, the calls of traders, the shuffle of boots on frost-dusted floors. And always the creak of wood as the castle's old timbers flexed in the cold. At night it was candles, crackling fires, and the occasional sound of lute or flute, playing melancholic songs of faraway places. The echoes in the halls gave every sound a distant quality, as though it came from the past. In winter, sound was swallowed by snow. Words spoken on one side of the courtyard could not carry to the other. It gave the castle a strange feeling, as if it floated in time, untethered from the urgency of the world below. A place for the forgotten. As the century turned and the political tides shifted, Ambras remained, mostly untouched. Ferdinand died in 1595. Philippine had passed before him. Their children lived under reduced titles, absorbed back into the web of Habsburg strategy. But the castle they built, its collections, improvements, and quiet rhythms survived. For a time, the Habsburgs used it to store overflow from other residences. Later, it was maintained as a minor site of interest. Unlike grand palaces that were expanded, redesigned, or demolished, Schloss Ambras remained mostly as it was in the 16th century. That in itself is unusual. It became a place for things that didn't quite fit elsewhere: paintings of forgotten nobles, armor too strange for Vienna, books written in dialects no longer used, and eventually it became a museum not by declaration but by accident. It simply outlasted its purpose. The Archduke's legacy. What did Ferdinand leave behind? Not power. He was not an emperor, not conquest. He led no wars of note. And yet, his collection practice, his commitment to documentation, and his philosophy of attention influenced how Europe remembered itself. Centuries later, scholars studying early scientific methods found themselves turning to Ferdinand's inventories. Artists found inspiration in his portraits. Anthropologists noted how his collection of wonders hinted at early taxonomy. And in museology, he is sometimes called a precursor to modern curators, a man who believed that even in silence, every object had a story. But perhaps most significantly, he proved that a man of means did not need a city to matter. From a castle above the clouds, Ferdinand shaped how the continent saw itself, not through grand acts, but through careful noticing. Unresolved thought. And so, one might ask, if Ferdinand II had not chosen seclusion, if he had ruled from Vienna like others, would Europe have lost one of its earliest museums? Or was it only in the cold, quiet breath of Ambras that such attention to detail could thrive? The post-Ferdinand era, a castle without its keeper. When Archduke Ferdinand II died in 1595, Schloss Ambras lost its steward, collector, and caretaker. His heirs, born of a morganatic marriage, were not entitled to inherit the political roles that would allow them to maintain the castle as a center of influence. The once vibrant mountaintop residence soon slipped into administrative ambiguity, still Habsburg property, but no longer a political priority. With the court gone, Ambras became quieter than ever. The grand salons fell into shadow. The curiosities remained, but their catalogers did not. Even the cleaning schedules changed. Without the foot traffic of minor nobles and collectors, rooms were dusted less often. The instruments sat untuned, the portraits stared blankly, their subjects now strangers even to the archivists. The 17th century would bring upheaval to the world below the 30 Years' War, religious fragmentation, and economic hardship. But Ambras, seated in its alpine perch, experienced these shifts at a distance. Its greatest threat was not battle but neglect. Preservation through neglect. In a strange twist of fate, Ambras's obscurity became its salvation. Castles that remained in use were modernized, remodeled, or repurposed. Walls were broken down for artillery access. Historic interiors were renovated to reflect changing tastes, but Ambras was largely left alone. Its architecture remained largely 16th century. The Spanish Hall, built by Ferdinand for musical performances and court banquets, retained its original Renaissance woodwork and frescoes remarkable because no one had reason to replace them. The collections stored in controlled rooms decayed slowly but steadily. Paper cracked, paint peeled, yet the environment was stable. Mountain air, though cold and damp, lacked the heat and pollution of cities. As a result, some artifacts survived far better than those kept in urban palaces or churches. By the 18th century, the castle was used sporadically to house soldiers, and once even as a sanatorium, though this was short-lived due to the difficulty of transporting patients to such elevation. For most of the 1700s and 1800s, Ambras slept not ruined, not restored, simply preserved by irrelevance. The rebirth of historical curiosity. It wasn't until the 19th century that European thinkers began to see value in the forgotten. Romanticism, the movement that embraced ruins, mystery, and melancholy, found in Ambras a near-perfect subject. Painters traveled to Tyrol to sketch the castle's silhouette against the mountain fog. Writers described it as a forgotten seat of old magic. The castle, without changing, became culturally relevant again, not because of what it did, but because of what it represented. A time lost, an age paused. In 1855, Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I ordered a limited renovation of Schloss Ambras. The goal wasn't to modernize it, but to stabilize it to prevent the slow erosion that centuries of snow, ice, and silence had caused. Rooms were cleaned, floors replaced, and most significantly, the collections were restored. The Kunstkammer, neglected but largely intact, became one of the first museum exhibits in a historical building, open to the public under the management of the Imperial House of Austria. Visitors climbed the same roads used by mule drivers in Ferdinand's time, now with a sense of reverence not for politics or nobility, but for curiosity itself. The birth of modern museology. In the early 20th century, curators began to see Schloss Ambras not just as a historical curiosity, but as a precursor to the modern museum. The way Ferdinand had organized his collections by theme, by material, by human category mirrored early taxonomies of knowledge that would define natural history and anthropology museums in later centuries. His room of portraits of unusual people was reinterpreted not as a cabinet of spectacle, but as an early attempt to document diversity, to visually represent those who lived on the margins of accepted society. While modern ethics would reject the sensationalism of some items, historians increasingly recognized that Ferdinand's work was serious, systematic, and meaningful in its time. Scholars noted that his labeling, inventory systems, and even placement of objects reflected a kind of information design far ahead of its era. Visitors to the lower castle, where the armory is still displayed today, walk through a living example of Renaissance-era data organization. In this way, Ambras became not just a castle but a thesis, showing how power can be expressed through preservation and how isolation can be a form of legacy. War and the fragility of memory. The 20th century, like so many centuries before it, brought war to Europe once more. During World War I, Austria was embroiled in the dissolution of empire. The collections of Ambras were boxed up, inventoried, and partially moved. The castle remained intact, but less accessible. World War II posed greater risks. As bombs fell across Europe, cultural treasures were hidden or displaced. Fortunately, Schloss Ambras was not a strategic target, and its treasures were considered safe, too far from the cities, too hard to reach, and of little value to the war effort. After the war, the Austrian government began to systematically reevaluate its cultural heritage. Ambras was restored to prominence not as a political site, but as a historical archive. Its rooms were opened again, this time not to nobles or collectors, but to students, tourists, and researchers. The site, operated by the Kunsthistorisches Museum of Vienna, was presented as the world's oldest museum in its original location, and marketed as a quiet, contemplative experience. To visit Ambras today is to enter a frozen dialogue between stone, sky, and memory. Lessons from the clouds. Why does Schloss Ambras matter? It was never a battlefield. No treaties were signed within its halls. Its halls echoed more often with silence than statecraft, and yet it endures in history. Because Ambras teaches us about what survives not through power, but through patience. Its story is not one of dramatic change, but of slow, uninterrupted continuity. It is a case study in the value of attention to objects, to people, to the act of preservation itself. While other castles crumbled or reinvented themselves, Ambras stayed still, and by doing so became one of Europe's most truthful storytellers. It tells the story of people who chose obscurity over fame, who valued observation over ambition, and who found in the altitude a clarity that the valleys could not provide. Epilogue: a castle for the sleepy. Today, when you walk through the stone corridors of Ambras, you are walking through uninterrupted history. The worn steps bear the shape of centuries. The light filtering through leaded windows is the same light Ferdinand saw. The mountain wind still curls under the doors. And though you may not find drama or spectacle, you will find something else. The weight of details, the rhythm of old routines, and the soft hum of a world that moved slowly but mattered. The drawers still open. The records still list inventories. The armor still stands mute and polished. If you lean in, you might hear the echo of a steward reciting stock, or perhaps just the wind, cold, constant, and utterly unbothered by time. Final reflection. What is history, if not a collection of what we choose to remember? And if a castle like Ambras, perched above the world, can survive through the careful attention of one man, what else might we preserve not through power, but through care? Story 2. Snow Fortresses of Georgia, Svaneti Stone Towers. A landscape of isolation and stone. High in the greater Caucasus Mountains, where the ridges of northwestern Georgia scrape the sky, lies a region untouched by the noise of history's empires. This is Svaneti, an ancient land of steep gorges, glacial rivers, and villages cradled between avalanche-prone slopes. From a distance, these settlements appear as gray clusters huddled in the snow-stone roofs, narrow alleys, and above all, the towers. Rising 4 to 6 stories, these medieval Svan towers, or koshki, dot the landscape like silent sentinels. Built between the 9th and 13th centuries, they served not only as defense, but as the centerpieces of a unique way of life, shaped by weather, war, and generational memory. Unlike the castles of Western Europe, these towers were not the homes of kings or noble lords. Instead, they were family-built fortresses, constructed by and for ordinary people, farmers, herders, and artisans, each household maintaining its own beacon of protection. If Schloss Ambras was a castle of contemplation, then Svaneti's towers were castles of continuity, quiet structures that held families together during centuries of storms, invaders, and long winters with no way out but through. Geography as destiny. Svaneti is surrounded by natural walls. To the north, Mount Shkara, the highest peak in Georgia at over 5,000 meters. To the south, dense forests and cliffside passes. Roads, when passable at all, are few and treacherous. For much of history, this meant that the people of Svaneti lived in practical isolation, cut off for months at a time by snow. This wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Isolation meant survival. While Georgian kingdoms were invaded by Mongols, Persians, and Ottomans, the highlanders of Svaneti built their lives apart. When the Black Death swept across Eurasia, it never reached these mountain villages. When empires rose and fell, Svaneti endured in silence, ruled not by foreign kings, but by kinship networks and old codes of honor. In this context, the tower was not just a building. It was a symbol of readiness, a message that the family inside was self-sufficient, vigilant, and not to be trifled with even by neighbors. Architecture of defense and daily use. Svan towers are striking in their simplicity. Built from rough-hewn stone, they rise vertically with minimal ornamentation. The walls are nearly a meter thick at the base and narrow slightly as they ascend. Inside, floors are made of wooden planks resting on timber beams. Most towers have only one external door, often several meters above ground level. Entry was typically through a wooden ladder, which could be pulled up in times of danger. Arrow slits and drop holes allowed defenders to launch projectiles while remaining safe inside. But what made these towers unique was their dual purpose. During peacetime, they served as grain stores, winter shelters for livestock, and cold weather sleeping quarters. Heat rose through the floors, and upper levels stayed warm even during snowstorms. In the event of blood feuds, a practice not uncommon in Highland, Georgia families could take refuge in their tower for weeks or months, sustained by stored food, water, and fuel. One surviving record from the 18th century mentions a family in Ushkula, Europe's highest continuously inhabited village, who sheltered in their tower for 47 days during a clan dispute, melting snow for water and living off salted meat and millet. The economy of high places. What does one do for a living at 2,000 meters elevation? Svaneti's economy revolved around pastoralism, particularly sheep and cattle herding, as well as small-scale agriculture in summer months. Barley and millet were hardy enough for the short growing season. Apples, berries, and root vegetables were stored underground or in stone-lined cellars called marani. Trade was rare but not absent. In spring and fall, trading caravans crossed the mountains from Mingrelaya and Racha, bringing salt, cloth, and iron tools in exchange for cheese, wool, and honey. Svaneti's famed salted cheese, aged in animal stomachs, was prized for its longevity, capable of surviving long journeys and long winters. Families also practiced seasonal migration. In summer, herders led animals to high pastures d'Gilly, setting up temporary camps and collecting herbs and medicinal plants. These traditions still survive today, passed down orally from one generation to the next. But economics was always secondary to survival. Winter preparation was an obsession. Each year was a race against the snow, roof thatching, firewood splitting, tool repair, and grain thrashing. Mistakes could mean death. Law, order, and the blood code. Svaneti did not operate under formal state rule for much of its history. Instead, it relied on customary law known as adati. These laws governed everything: property disputes, land boundaries, marriage contracts, and above all, honor conflicts. Blood feuds, krev, were an accepted part of the culture. If a murder occurred, the offender's family was required to pay blood compensation or face retribution. Families often turned to mediation councils, called sabchio, composed of elders and respected men, to negotiate peace or enforce penalties. Towers played a role here too. A family under threat could signal from its tower using torches, drums, or horn blasts. Neighboring families would watch from their own towers, forming a network of watchers. In this way, even in the deepest snow, news traveled. Some families took pride in their tower's role during famous feuds. One oral account tells of a woman who held off attackers for days with only her sons, and a pot of boiling barley water poured from the arrow slits onto intruders below. Religion, magic, and the everyday. Svanetti's religious life was a hybrid of Christian and pagan beliefs. Though nominally Georgian Orthodox, the Highlanders incorporated pre-Christian deities, mountain spirits, and ritual practices that baffled urban clergy. Each village had a sacred grove or stone where offerings were made, often animal blood or bread, depending on the occasion. St. George, the warrior saint, was especially venerated, often depicted on tower frescoes slaying a dragon or, in some cases, more local beasts like wolves and bears. Icons were painted on wooden boards, sometimes in secret, and passed down as family talismans. These icons were not just religious, they were protective objects, believed to guard the home from avalanches, bad harvests, or unexplained illness. Magic and superstition filled the voids left by science. People believed in Dev, mountain spirits who punished liars, and Lamias, evil women who drained the strength from men in their sleep. These tales were not entertainment, they were warnings, rooted in survival. And again, the towers featured in this cosmology. They were seen not only as physical protection but as spiritual fortresses, meant to keep out not just men, but malevolent forces of the mountain itself. Winter comes without ceremony. There are few written records from Svanetti before the 19th century. Most of what we know comes from oral histories, archaeological surveys, and the travel accounts of Russians and Europeans who ventured there. But every account agrees on this. Winter came suddenly and it stayed. A blanket of snow could fall in early October and not melt until May. Families closed their doors, locked their towers, and entered a world of slow time. Days were measured by candle length, meals by the thickness of porridge. Children carved toys from bone. Women spun wool beside stone stoves. Men maintained tools by hand again and again until their handles were smooth as river stones. There was no dramatic storytelling. Life was repetition, keeping the stove lit, keeping the cow alive, keeping one's family warm. And somehow in all this slowness, culture grew not grand, not golden, but deep. The towers of Svanetti were never symbols of triumph. They were witnesses. They kept watch as languages shifted, as borders changed, as the world outside modernized. And yet they remained, planted in the stone, looking down on a history they never asked to join. Unresolved thought. So as the fire crackled and snow fell silently over the mountain villages, one might ask, were the towers built to protect the people, or was it the people who protected the towers? The creak of change at high altitude. In the lowlands, history moves with fanfare. Crowns are exchanged, borders redrawn, wars named and retold. But in Svanetti, history arrives slowly as a stranger first glimpsed in the distance, before it decides to knock. By the 19th century, the great powers of Eurasia were pressing into the Caucasus. The Russian Empire, expanding southward, saw the region not as remote and untouchable, but as strategically vital. For centuries, the Georgian kingdoms had acted as a buffer zone between Persian, Ottoman, and Russian interests. Svanetti, isolated and self-governing, now found itself in the path of empire. It wasn't taken by force at first. The region had already become a kind of curiosity. Ethnographers and military surveyors from Moscow and Tbilisi journeyed up the mountain passes, often with sketchbooks and rifles in equal measure. They reported a people both deeply traditional and unknowably foreign. But as the Russian presence solidified in Georgia by the mid-1800s, Svanetti was brought under administrative control, albeit loosely. The towers, once symbols of family sovereignty, now stood beneath an imperial sky. An attempt at integration. The Russian Empire rarely ruled with a gentle hand. It relied on military governors, forced conscription, and heavy taxation, even in regions that had previously governed themselves through custom and council. In Svanetti, this created a cultural collision. The Svans, proud of their independence, resisted in subtle ways. They withheld taxes, ignored summons, and when necessary, retreated into the towers not to fight a war, but to outlast it. It was a strategy learned over centuries. Administrators grew frustrated. One noted in an 1852 letter that the towers afford these peasants the arrogance of kings, lamenting the difficulty of enforcement. Punitive expeditions were sent, and a few towers were destroyed as warnings. But the mountains were on the side of the Svan's harsh terrain that could freeze a battalion into inaction. Still, a slow erosion took place. With Russian roads came new trade goods, and with them, new dependencies. Factory textiles replaced home-woven cloth. Sugar arrived in lumps, and with sugar came tea, a luxury that became habit-forming in villages that had never seen such things before. The towers watched it all, stone-faced and unmoved. But inside, the rhythm of life began to change. Blood feuds and bureaucracy. One of the most stubborn challenges for the Russian authorities was the Svans' adherence to blood law. Feuds were still active, despite being officially outlawed. Local mediators continued to resolve disputes, even as Russian judges attempted to impose czarist legal codes. When Russian officers attempted to arrest individuals involved in long-standing vendettas, entire families would retreat into their towers. Stalemates could last for months. Rather than risk escalation, some Russian officials began quietly acknowledging the unwritten rules, allowing feuds to be resolved according to custom so long as they remained local. It was an unintended admission that the towers still held power, not through force, but through the sheer inertia of tradition. Interestingly, by the late 1800s, this led to an informal dual system, Russian courts on paper and Svan councils in practice. The Adati endured not because it was better, but because it was trusted. The decline of the towers. By the dawn of the 20th century, the towers themselves began to change not from attack, but from irrelevance. New forms of housing emerged. Single-story stone homes with metal roofs replaced the traditional tower complexes. Firewood became easier to transport with mule carts. Peace, ironically, made towers unnecessary. With fewer blood feuds, there was less need to defend. Families stopped maintaining their towers. Wooden floors rotted. Roofs collapsed. Some towers were even cannibalized for stone to build more modern homes nearby. The towers, built to last, were not destroyed but forgotten. Still, in villages like Chajashi, Ushkuli, Mestia, and Latali, some towers remained intact not from use, but from respect. They were seen not just as homes, but as symbols of ancestors. Some families still climbed into them each year to clean the dust, repair wooden beams, or simply light a candle. War, revolution, and resistance. The Soviet Revolution brought seismic changes to Georgia and to Svaneti, eventually. Collectivization, anti-religious campaigns, and centralized control reached even the highest mountain valleys. Resistance came not in armed rebellion, but in quiet refusals. Icons were hidden inside towers, beneath floorboards, and in disused grain bins. Clergy disguised themselves as shepherds, performing baptisms by firelight. In the 1930s, Soviet archaeologists came to survey the towers, but many locals refused to cooperate, citing roof damage or dangerous conditions to keep them out. Some towers, ironically, survived because they were deemed too remote to matter. The Soviets focused on urban development, and the towers, built centuries ago for self-sufficiency, once again escaped the full reach of modern authority. Yet others were repurposed, used for grain storage, barns, or even military outposts during World War II. A few were demolished to make way for roads or infrastructure. But in the hidden folds of the mountains, many simply remained, unnoticed by planners. A new kind of intrusion, tourism. By the 1980s, Georgia, still part of the USSR, began cautiously promoting Svaneti as a site of ethnographic interest. Photographers and mountaineers came, amazed by the preserved medieval skyline of Ushkuli, where dozens of towers still stood amid glaciers and grazing animals. After Georgia's independence in 1991, Svaneti faced years of hardship, civil unrest, economic collapse, and isolation returned. The towers again became refuges, not from feuds, but from modern uncertainty. It wasn't until the 2000s that tourism returned in earnest. Roads improved. Guest houses opened. The Georgian government, with support from UNESCO, began formal restoration programs. Ushkili was declared a World Heritage Site, and Mesja saw an influx of investment hotels, cafes, even a ski resort. Today, some towers are open to visitors. Others remain privately owned. A few are still used for storage or ritual purposes, but always they stand in the landscape like pages of a very old book, one that never cared to be read quickly. Continuity in stone. Unlike castles that were designed to dominate or dazzle, Svan towers were built to blend in. Their shapes mimic the ridges around them. Their stones were pulled from the same slopes they overlook. They are both shelter and statement, both architecture and ancestry. The families who built them are still there. Their surnames are often the same. Their songs and stories are passed down not through writing, but through evenings around the hearth, through ritual toasts, and through the precise act of walking the same trail as one's great-grandfather. Some towers are now roofless, some lean slightly, but many still stand. Not one was built with modern engineering. They endure because of their thickness, their placement, and above all, their purpose, which, despite the centuries, has changed very little, to keep memory alive when the world forgets. Unresolved thought. And so we might ask, when a structure outlives its builders, its purpose, and even its enemies, what does it become? A monument, a memory, or something else entirely? The quiet towers of today. It is morning in Svaneti. In the village of Ushkili, the sun climbs slowly over the icy shoulders of Mount Shkara. Sheep bleat softly in the distance, and a man in a wool hat chops firewood near a weathered wooden shed. Behind him, as always, the towers stand. They are not adorned. There are no banners or crests, just ancient, worn stones arranged in vertical defiance of wind, snow, and gravity. Some lean slightly, others are scarred with moss or shrapnel marks from old conflicts, but they endure. In a modern world obsessed with spectacle and speed, the towers of Svaneti are stubbornly, meaningfully uneventful. They do not pretend to be romantic. They do not entertain. They simply exist as places once full of breath, now full of memory. Cultural survival in stone and song. Despite the shifts of time, the Svan people remain culturally distinct from other Georgian communities. Their language Svanuri is not mutually intelligible with Standard Georgian and is one of the oldest surviving Kartvelian tongues, now considered endangered. It survives not in textbooks but in towers. Inside their cool stone walls, stories were told, secrets kept, songs sung for centuries. Many Svan songs are polyphonic, echoing with layered, haunting harmonies that imitate the sound of wind, avalanche, or loss. Songs are performed without instruments. The towers, with their high ceilings and narrow chambers, amplify these voices with soft, natural reverb. In this way, architecture becomes part of the oral tradition. These performances are rarely formal. A song might arise after a meal, during the cleaning of tools, or while preparing winter stores. And as it rises, it fills the same air once warmed by generations past. One such song, passed from mother to daughter, is a lullaby believed to be over 500 years old. It speaks not of angels or dreams, but of waiting for the snow to melt and the father's return from the pastures. In Svaneti, lullabies are about endurance, sacred towers, and the seasons of ritual. Svan religious practice remains a curious and powerful blend of Christian and pre-Christian elements. Though most villagers now attend Orthodox services, ancient seasonal rituals tied to towers still persist. During Lamproba, an ancestral festival held in early spring. Villagers climb to the towers at dusk with pine torches, circling the stone bases in silence before lighting small fires. The festival is meant to honor the dead, but also to remind the living that the tower is more than shelter. It is a house for memory, shared by all who came before. Locals say that the towers hear the names during these rituals. To light a flame and speak the name of one's great-grandfather is not symbolic, it is an act of restoration, reminding the land who once walked here. In some villages, towers are formally closed in a symbolic rite when a family line dies out. The door is sealed with a stone, the hearth left cold, and the building is no longer used. These sealed towers are left to decay naturally, not from neglect but respect. They are understood to be complete. Restoration and the edge of change. In the 21st century, Svaneti faces the same forces that reshape rural communities everywhere: migration, climate change, and the growing presence of tourism. Many younger Svans leave the mountains for Tbilisi or abroad, seeking work and education. Some towers now stand over empty homes, their hearths cold for years. And yet, something unusual is happening. Unlike other regions where modernity simply sweeps the old away, Svaneti is restoring from within. Families with means are rebuilding towers not as hotels or novelties, but as living homes. They fix the wooden staircases, reinforce the walls with lime mortar, and carefully preserve the original footprints. One such example is the Margiani Tower in Mestia, restored by descendants who now use it to teach visitors about Svan history. It includes a women's floor, where elderly grandmothers slept, close to the kitchen and children. The lower floors stored tools, hay, and milk vessels. The top floor, always the coldest, was for watching. This multi-purpose vertical life is being documented, honored, and slowly revived. The stones that outlived empire. In their quiet way, the towers are a counterargument to the empires that tried to contain them. They outlasted the Georgian kingdoms, the Mongols, the Ottoman border threats, the Russian imperial governors, and the Soviet Union. And they will likely outlast many who look upon them today. Their secret: they were never built to be famous. They were built to solve real problems: protection from avalanches and attacks, storage during 7-month winters, and defense in family feuds. Their humble functionality is precisely why they lasted. A wall thick enough to stop arrows will also stop time. A door built 3 meters above the ground will resist not only enemies but erosion, mold, and curiosity. And a community that builds for endurance rather than spectacle leaves behind structures worth preserving, not because they are beautiful, though they are, but because they are honest. Ghosts and reminders. Walk through Ushkulai or Mestia in the fading light, and you'll notice something odd. The towers look back. They are not like the facades of city buildings. Their windows are too small to see through, and yet they seem to watch you. Their verticality draws the eye. Their silence asks questions. What would it be like to live your whole life with your home also being your fortress? What would it mean to mark each season not with holidays, but with stockpiling, stitching, mending, and remembering? To live in the towers was to understand that history doesn't happen elsewhere, it happens slowly, through you, as your daily work becomes the memory of a people. A future made of stone and snow. Today, Svaneti's towers are protected by law, tourism boards, and global heritage lists, but their true preservation will depend on something quieter: attention. Will the songs be sung? Will the stories be told? Will the staircases be mended before they collapse? Will the children of the mountain return? There is hope. Schools now teach Svanuri as an elective. Cultural centers in Mestia and Ushkulai host craft workshops, where younger residents learn to build window shutters, roof frames, and grain chests, all in the old ways. And each year, when snow seals the passes again, villagers still light fires. They still spin wool. And sometimes, when the wind howls outside, A family will gather in the old tower and wait it out, as their ancestors did not with fear, but with patience. Final reflection. And so the towers of Svaneti remain not as ruins, not as relics, but as reminders that the most resilient histories are not always loud. That meaning can rise from stone, silence, and snow. And that sometimes, to be forgotten by the world is exactly what lets you survive it. Story 3. The Monasteries in the Sky, Meteora's Floating Worlds. A landscape that defies logic. In the central Greek region of Thessaly, not far from the town of Kalimbaka, a series of sandstone rock pillars pierce the sky. Some are 400 meters tall, their surfaces weathered into surreal shapes by wind, rain, and time. Balanced precariously on top of these natural towers are monasteries, not ruins, but still functioning sanctuaries of solitude. This is Meteora from the Greek meteoros, meaning suspended in air. It is a place so visually improbable, so steeped in stillness, that travelers sometimes mistake it for a dream or a movie set. But long before tourists arrived, these rocks were homes, fortresses, and temples for those who chose isolation over comfort, asceticism over security, and silence over speech. Meteora is not just a place of worship. It is a blueprint of survival, spiritual, physical, and cultural. Built by monks who climbed higher to escape the world, these monasteries embody boring but profound history of slow stonework, quiet prayer, and everyday life lived in the sky. The stone pillars and their secrets. The rocks of Meteora formed over 60 million years ago, the result of rivers and seas depositing layers of sandstone and conglomerate. Over time, tectonic shifts raised the land, and erosion carved the pillars into their present forms. By the 11th century, the cliffs were already known to hermits. Small caves nestled into the faces of the rock began to show signs of life: black soot, carved footholds, and eventually, tiny wooden platforms. These were the homes of anchorites, Christian ascetics who sought absolute isolation to commune with God. They lived without possessions, without speech. Their days were measured not by bells or liturgy but by sunlight and birdsong. Some stayed for weeks, others for decades. One such cave, near the modern-day Holy Trinity Monastery, still bears the name Skeet of St. Gregory, a dwelling of a monk who reportedly lived 38 years without descending, his food delivered by a basket on a rope. These early inhabitants left few records, but the evidence remains: handholds cut into vertical rock, ladder scars, and niches for candles, barely wide enough for a man to turn. These are not the grand symbols of institutional religion. They are fingerprints of devotion etched in stone. The rise of monastic Meteora. By the 14th century, the Byzantine world was unraveling. Raids from Turkish tribes, instability from within, and the fall of central authority made cities unsafe even for monks. It was during this time that organized monasticism arrived at Meteora. The first and most significant figure was Athanasios Koinovitis, a monk from Mount Athos, who around 1356 founded the great Meteoron monastery on the broadest and highest rock, Platylithos. It would become the model for others. With just a few followers, Athanasios built a wooden chapel, sleeping cells, and water storage cisterns, using stone pulled up in baskets, one rock at a time. He had no engineers, no scaffolding, only faith, patience, and a pulley system. His goal wasn't just escape from war. It was to build a space above temptation, above distraction, above politics. The monastery was a self-contained world: garden, refectory, chapel, infirmary, and ossuary, a spiritual fortress. Within a few decades, more monasteries followed: Varlam, Rausanu, Holy Trinity, St. Nicholas Anaposes, and others, eventually numbering 24. Each was isolated, each was built with unhurried care, and each was run according to the strict rule of Orthodox Cenobitic life: shared meals, shared silence, shared prayer. Life in the sky. Contrary to the grandeur tourists might imagine, daily life in Meteora was simple to the point of austerity. The monks rose at 3 or 4 a.m. for matins, followed by a day of manual labor, reading, and liturgical services. The rocktop monasteries had to be entirely self-sufficient. There was no running water. Rain was collected in stone cisterns. Food was grown in small rooftop gardens or delivered via rope lifts barrels filled with beans, olives, or dried bread. Each monastery had a mule path or a hanging net for supplies. Some monks spent days hauling items from the valley below. Others carved cisterns into the rock, carefully calculating rainfall and usage. One mistake could mean weeks without water. Cooking was done over wood-burning stoves, often with limited ingredients. On fasting days, which included over 180 days a year, meals were strictly vegetarian: lentils, boiled greens, black bread. The point was not enjoyment but humility. Medical care was improvised. Herbal remedies from cliffside plants, thyme, wild sage, oregano were cataloged and passed down through handwritten manuals. Illness was treated with compresses, prayer, and rest. The infirmary cell in the Great Meteoron still contains stone basins used to heat poultices. In this world, nothing was wasted. Broken tools were repurposed. Candle stubs were melted down and reused. Even time itself was portioned carefully. Boredom was not a failure, it was an invitation to contemplation. Architecture of patience. Building anything on a rock column 400 meters high is a miracle of planning and repetition. The early monasteries used no cranes or modern tools. Every stone, beam, and brick was hoisted by hand, using a windlass, a kind of human-powered winch. Imagine this. You are a monk in 1390. You need timber for a floor. You lower a rope, slowly reel up the log, pausing every few turns to rest. Then you and a fellow monk cut the log by hand, plane it, and carry it across a narrow wooden bridge lashed together with rope. You do this not once but hundreds of times for walls, ceilings, benches, and doors. You wait for the right weather, for the wind to ease, for the rope to hold. You measure your days in pulley turns. The staircases many see today, solid stone steps winding up the cliffs, are modern additions. For centuries, the only access was removable ladders or netted baskets, raised and lowered as needed. An old Meteora joke goes, "How often do you change the rope?" "Only when it breaks." It was meant seriously. Books, binders, and boredom. Meteora also became a haven for manuscript preservation. During the fall of Constantinople and the Ottoman period, the monasteries served as repositories of religious and scholarly texts, kept safe from looting and censorship. Each monastery had a scriptorium, a quiet room where monks copied books by hand. Not just Bibles, but also medical texts, histories, hymnals, and commentaries by church fathers. Paper was scarce, so was ink. Parchment was reused. Margins are filled with notations, corrections, side prayers, even grocery lists. The monks bound their volumes in goatskin and wood, stitched with linen thread, often dyed with local plants. Copying was slow. A page might take a day, but speed was never the goal. As one monk wrote in a margin, "The hand tires, the back bends, but the soul climbs." A refuge in dangerous times. Meteora's height was not only metaphorical. During the Ottoman centuries, the monasteries offered physical refuge for rebels, villagers, and priests fleeing persecution. Local families would hide in the caves at the base, or even inside monastery storerooms. The monks never resisted Ottoman rule openly, but they used their altitude to their advantage. Messages were passed via coded icons, visible only to those who knew the signs. Resistance was quiet, measured in survival rather than defiance. Even during World War II, the monasteries played a role in sheltering refugees and hiding manuscripts from German and Italian occupation forces. Bombs fell in nearby Kalambaka, but Meteora's height saved it once more. To this day, some staircases remain sealed reminders of a time when the only defense was remoteness. Unresolved thought. So, as you stand at the base of a Meteora cliff and look up past the switchbacks, the wind-worn rock, and the improbable silhouette of a chapel, one might wonder, was it the monks who climbed toward God, or was it the world that fell away beneath them? Beyond the view, the monastic network. From the valley floor, Meteora's monasteries seem almost mythical, isolated citadels, suspended above reality. But from within, life followed a carefully woven network of interdependence. Each monastery was autonomous, yes, but not alone. There was a rhythm between the cliffs. Monks from different pillars traded goods: olive oil, wax, ink, vegetables, medicinal herbs, all carried in baskets across the void. Small messages were passed in scrolls tucked into food sacks. Each basket, rope lift, and whispered exchange formed part of a monastic communication system, informal yet essential. If a monastery fell ill or short of supplies, it could rely on its neighbors not just spiritually, but practically. Despite the perception of isolation, these were not hermits. Meteora was home to Cenobitic monks, those who live in communal monasteries, with shared duties, common prayer, and strict hierarchies. They served under an abbot, and their days were organized around the divine office, punctuating work with worship. Some monasteries specialized in gardening, others in text preservation, others still in hospitality for rare pilgrims. But all participated in the same slow miracle, keeping the sacred alive through monotony. Labor as worship. The motto among Meteora's monastics was clear: ora et labora, pray and work. There was no division between the sacred and the mundane. Scrubbing floors, repairing stone steps, copying manuscripts, tending to ill brethren, or grinding flour, each task was approached with the same solemnity as liturgy. One 15th century rulebook from the Varlam monastery lists more than 40 daily tasks, divided into rotating duties. The tone is not fiery or theological, it reads more like a maintenance manual. 3rd hour, sweep upper cloister, check ropes for fray. 5th hour, heat water for infirmary, replace wax tapers in refectory if consumed. It's easy to romanticize monastic life as otherworldly, but in Meteora, it was deeply practical. The rocks demanded it. You couldn't pray all day if the roof leaked. You couldn't contemplate the heavens if the rope snapped mid-hoist. This sense of material responsibility became a kind of spiritual discipline, not flashy, not dramatic, but meaningful in its constancy. The art of making things last. On top of the stone cliffs, resources were limited. Everything had to last. Textiles were patched endlessly. A monk's robe might be handed down and repaired for 2 or 3 generations. Brooms were made from bundles of stiff herbs, sandals from rope and scrap leather. Metal tools were rare, blunt knives, bent nails, cracked hinges were treated like gold. Stonework was the main form of construction and repair. The sandstone of the cliffs could be quarried carefully, but only in dry seasons. Rain made it too brittle. Monks became self-taught masons, mixing lime with ash to form mortar, aligning walls with crude plumb lines, and laying stones by eye and instinct. One of the most enduring traditions was wood carving. The iconostasis, the carved wooden screen separating the altar from the nave, was the pride of each monastery's chapel. These were intricate works, often depicting scenes from the life of Christ, forest animals, grapevines, or symbolic birds. The monks believed carving taught patience. A single vine might take months to chisel into a walnut beam. One stroke too hard and the wood would split. Better to stop early and pray than to rush and ruin it. Women and the walls. While most of Meteora's monastic institutions were male-only, the role of women in the Meteora ecosystem is often underappreciated. Women from the surrounding villages, particularly from Castraki and Kalambaka, supplied the monasteries with essentials: wool, thread, cheese, milk, soap, candles, and seasonal produce. Many did so without entering the monasteries, especially during stricter centuries when women were barred even from the courtyards. Some of the region's finest embroidered altar cloths and vestments were sewn by women who never saw the chapels they adorned. In one preserved letter, a nun from a nearby convent writes to a Meteora monk, "Here are the cuffs, stitched as you requested, with vines and lions. I hope they suit your feast of the Forerunner." Eventually, the monastery of Rausanu perched on a slender, narrow rock became a convent, allowing Orthodox nuns to reclaim a space once reserved for men. Today, Rausanu remains one of the most active of Meteora's religious sites, maintained by women who balance prayer with the same quiet labors once done by their male predecessors: gardening, candle making, scripture reading, and silent witness. Illness, death, and the ossuaries. High-altitude monasteries were not spared the realities of aging and death. The rocks may have been remote, but the body still failed, still suffered. Each monastery had an infirmary, a small room with cots, blankets, and a few herbal remedies. More than one monk died from falls, fevers, or respiratory illness worsened by the damp conditions. When a monk died, his body was buried in a small crypt or courtyard. Years later, the bones were disinterred, cleaned, and placed in the ossuary, a humble stone room where skulls were stacked, often labeled by name and date of death. The ossuary was not macabre, it was a classroom. Monks would sit there to reflect, reminded of their own impermanence. As one simple inscription reads, "Today it is I, tomorrow it is you." It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to live slowly, attentively, and with clarity. The rhythm of the year. Unlike the fixed calendar of cities, monastic life followed a liturgical and agricultural cycle. The changing light, the lengthening shadows on the cliff walls, the return of birds, or the first frost, these marked the true seasons. Harvest festivals, fasting weeks, saints' days, these were the moments that broke the repetition. One of the most poignant was the Feast of the Transfiguration, celebrated each August. The monks would wake before dawn, light torches, and gather on the cliff's edge. As the sun rose behind Mount Koziakas, chants would fill the air, low, resonant, and slow. In that moment, Meteora was truly what its name promised, suspended between worlds, a place not of spectacle but of stillness. Meteora in decline. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the number of active monasteries began to dwindle. Wars, Ottoman taxes, earthquakes, and changing attitudes toward monasticism led to abandonment. Of the 24 monasteries once active, only 6 remain today in regular use. Some were destroyed by weather, others by war. Several were simply emptied out, their stairways rotted, their chapels overgrown. A few were looted, but many were left as they had been, quiet, high, and crumbling. Even so, the monks had succeeded in their real aim, not survival of buildings, but preservation of ways of being humble, patient, enduring. Unresolved thought. And so, as you gaze up at a monastery barely visible on the craggy edge of a cliff, you might ask, was this life harder or simpler? Was it an escape from the world or a way of truly entering it, one stone, one prayer, one task at a time? A legacy that never shouted. By the 20th century, Meteora had become a shadow of itself. The monasteries, once alive with chanting and community, had fallen largely silent. Of the original 24, many were in ruins, roofs caved in, stairs collapsed, wall paintings faded beneath moss and bird droppings. For the few remaining monks, life continued with quiet stubbornness. They still lit the morning oil lamps, still prepared the bread, still traced the cross over the well-worn stone threshold of their chapels. But they were alone, and the modern world was descending. As roads reached deeper into Thessaly, Kalimbaka grew from a sleepy market town into a regional center. Electricity arrived. Paved highways replaced goat trails. Tourists, curious and camera-laden, began to arrive. First dozens, then hundreds. By the 1970s, Meteora had been discovered. And with that discovery came the question: could something built to be hidden survive in a world that demands visibility? War, vandalism, and revival. Meteora did not escape the turmoil of the modern age. During World War II, German and Italian troops occupied parts of Greece, including Kalimbaka. Several monasteries were looted, and a few buildings were damaged by aerial bombardments mistaken for military outposts. Icons were stolen. Manuscripts disappeared. Some monks fled. Others stayed and hid sacred items in cave niches, their locations lost for decades. Then came the Greek Civil War, 1946–1949. The cliffs, once a refuge from medieval chaos, became strategic points of control. Rope bridges were destroyed. Monasteries were abandoned again. By the 1950s, Meteora was almost a ruin, not because it had aged, but because the world around it had changed too fast. And yet slowly, restoration began. With assistance from the Greek Orthodox Church, the Ministry of Culture, and eventually UNESCO, monks and nuns returned. Roofs were patched. Frescoes were restored using ancient techniques: egg tempera, natural pigments, and infinite patience. Staircases were rebuilt, this time in stone. Electricity was added discreetly, with minimal intrusion. The question was no longer whether Meteora would survive. The question became: how could it continue without losing what made it matter? The tension of tourism. Today, Meteora is one of Greece's most visited sites. Tour buses idle below the cliffs. Cafes line the road to the base. Drones hover overhead. Postcards and refrigerator magnets bear the iconic silhouette of Varlam or Rousanu floating on their stone thrones. Tourism has brought income, protection, and relevance, but also risk. The monks and nuns now live in tension, preserving sacred space in an age that sees it as aesthetic. Some visitors enter the chapels in silence. Others take selfies. The refectories are lined with ropes, separating tourists from the very tables where monks still eat in silence. Signage is clear. This is a living monastery, not a museum. But the lines blur. To walk up to a monastery today is to walk between eras. Modern steps carved into the cliff. Byzantine frescoes on ancient stone. A cash register beside a 600-year-old prayer book. A nun in full habit dusting a centuries-old bookshelf while someone asks for Wi-Fi. And yet they remain calm. The monks and nuns tend their gardens. They teach. They pray. They cook. Some welcome visitors. Others keep to silence. In their world, time is not linear. It loops slowly around the liturgical year, around the cloister paths. The power of stillness. Meteora's real strength has never been its engineering or even its beauty. It's the intention behind it. That stillness can be sacred. That distance can bring clarity. That life, even at its dullest sweeping, peeling onions, repairing stone, can be profound when performed with care. The monks never claimed to change the world, but they recorded it, preserved it, held a mirror to it high above the noise. In that sense, Meteora is not a relic, it is a warning, a suggestion, a reminder that not everything must be fast to be important, and that some of the most durable things are made quietly over time. A new chapter, the nuns of Rousanu. Perhaps the clearest symbol of continuity is the nunnery of Rousanu. Abandoned in the early 20th century, it was revived in the 1980s by a small group of Orthodox nuns. They brought with them not grandeur but discipline. They repaired the wooden floors with salvaged beams, planted herbs, repainted icons in silence. Today, Rousanu is among the most active of the Meteora monasteries. The nuns host pilgrims, lead prayer services, and sell handmade incense and beeswax candles to support their work. They maintain the gardens with meticulous care. Lavender, rosemary and roses line the paths. A visitor who enters quietly may hear chanting drifting through the stone walls unamplified, unchanged. Here the monastic vow of service is not theatrical. It's domestic, even dull, making soap, tending a fig tree, writing receipts by hand in old notebooks. And yet this is the legacy: stillness made visible, work made holy. Meteora today, between heaven and earth still. The remaining 6 active monasteries, Great Meteoron, Varlam, Rausanu, St. Stephen, Holy Trinity, and St. Nicholas Anapauses, each hold their own rhythm. Some have just a few residents. Others host students, artists, or liturgical scholars. A few days a week, visitation is limited so the monks can pray in peace. There are restoration teams, funded by the Greek government and UNESCO, who work year-round to stabilize foundations, preserve wall paintings, and catalog centuries-old texts that are still being discovered in dusty niches behind altars. Some monasteries are experimenting with digital archives, so future generations can access these records. But the monks and nuns still keep written logs, just as they did in the 16th century, daily notes in longhand, often unadorned. Today we repaired the southern cistern wall. Rain expected Thursday. One visitor from Romania asked for prayer for his wife. In their record-keeping, Meteora is still Meteora. Final reflection. So what remains after all these centuries? Stone and silence, ropes and prayer, not a history of conquest or kings, but a history of maintenance, of choosing to endure rather than ascend. Meteora is not the story of what rose. It is the story of what refused to fall. A sanctuary built on eroding cliffs, where nothing flashy ever happened, just centuries of careful, faithful repetition. And perhaps that's the real miracle. That somewhere in the world, a group of people still rise each day, not to be remembered, but simply to continue. Story 4, Taikta's Mountain Fortress, Echoes of Samurai Fog. A castle in the clouds. In the Asego region of Hyogo Prefecture, western Japan, a strange phenomenon unfolds nearly every autumn morning. As the sun rises, dense fog fills the valleys below, and a stone fortress emerges, seemingly floating above the clouds. This is Taiktajo, often called the Machu Picchu of Japan, though it predates the term. More accurately, it's a Yamajiro, a mountain castle built not to dominate a city, but to endure in obscurity. Perched 353 meters above sea level, Taikta Castle is now a ruin, its walls crumbled, its towers long gone. But even in its reduced form, it speaks clearly, not of conquest or glory, but of slow construction, weather-worn survival, and the ordinary people who built and supported it in the fog-laced mountains. It was not the seat of a shogun. It was not the setting for great battles, but it was vital in ways history rarely writes about. Its story is one of logistics, planning, and perseverance of a fortress built not just for defense, but for the long, cold wait between conflicts. The Age of Castles. To understand Taikta Castle, one must first understand its time, the Muromachi period, 1336–1573, a time of decentralized power, frequent skirmishes, and the slow, uneven rise of regional lords called daimyo. During this time, Japan had no clear center. The shogunate in Kyoto struggled to maintain order, while local families built fortified homes and strongholds on hillsides and plateaus to protect their rice, their people, and their pride. Taikta Castle was built in 1443 by Adagaki Mitsukage, a retainer of the powerful Yamana clan, under orders to establish a stronghold on Mount Kojo. Its purpose: to watch over trade routes and to secure the region from incursions by rival clans. But it was not a castle of luxury. There were no golden screens, no lacquered chambers. Instead, Taikta was a stone skeleton, a labyrinth of terraces, gates, and angular walls laid carefully into the contours of the mountain. stone upon stone, building at elevation. The construction of Takeda was a feat of calculation, not of spectacle. Every stone, hundreds of thousands, was carried or quarried on site, some the size of small boulders. The walls were built in a technique known as Nizuri, where unshaped stones were stacked without mortar, relying on weight, gravity, and careful placement. This method allowed the walls to absorb earthquakes and subtle shifts in the mountain soil. At first glance, the layout seems irregular, but upon closer inspection, Takeda's design reflects deep strategic foresight. The central keep was surrounded by kuruwa, or Bailey's layered enclosures for troops and supplies. Narrow gates created choke points, while blind corners gave defenders the advantage over attackers unfamiliar with the layout. The key feature wasn't the walls, it was the elevation. Anyone approaching had to do so uphill, on narrow ridges easily visible from the top. Attackers could be seen hours in advance. Building in this location meant hauling timber, stones, and food up winding trails, often in snow or summer heat. Workers, likely peasants conscripted for seasonal labor, left no records. Their names are unknown. Their contribution, everything. Daily life in a high fortress. Unlike Kyoto's glittering castles or Edo's military palaces, Takeda was a working stronghold, not a showpiece. Its life was defined not by dramatic events, but by dull routine. Defenders lived in wooden barracks within the baileys. They tended vegetable plots, managed firewood supplies, and maintained the gates, stone drains, and observation posts. In quiet seasons, most of the garrison would descend to the village below, leaving behind a skeleton crew of guards. The air at the top was cold, especially in winter. Fires were hard to maintain without chimneys, and water had to be collected in cisterns, filled by rainfall or carried up manually. Every drop was precious. Records indicate that the castle had at least 3 watch stations, equipped with drums or conch shells to sound alerts. A guard's job was mostly boring, watching fog, watching trees, watching the silence. Occasionally, messengers would arrive climbing for hours bringing letters from the Yamana clan. Orders, requests, warnings. And then silence again. The village below. For every stone laid at Takeda, there were 10 planted in the rice paddies below. At the foot of Mount Kojo was the castle town, home to farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, and merchants, people whose lives revolved around a castle they likely never entered. They built tools, milled grain, tended fields, paid taxes in rice mostly. Their tax payments fed the garrison. Their surplus built the stockpiles. Their children sometimes carried supplies uphill during seasonal deliveries. A few may have trained with spears during times of crisis, but most would never draw a weapon. And yet they were the reason the castle could function. Takeda wasn't defended by walls. It was sustained by infrastructure. Fog as defense. One of the most fascinating aspects of Takeda Castle was not built, but inherited from the mountain itself, the fog. Mount Kojo is famous for its morning mist, especially in autumn and early winter. This natural phenomenon gave the castle its other nickname, Castle in the Sky. But for defenders, fog was a tactical gift. It concealed supply movements. It prevented accurate mapping by enemy scouts. It could hide reinforcements or allow a discreet retreat. In one surviving account, sparse, just a few sentences in an old scroll, a small band of Yamana men reportedly slipped out of Takeda under the cover of fog to ambush a scouting party near the Takeda River. Whether true or embellished, the story illustrates a simple truth. Fog was not an obstacle, it was a weapon. Cultural quietness. Unlike castles associated with famous battles or powerful warlords, Takeda Castle has little drama in the records. Its significance was regional, its reputation modest, but its design, maintenance, and function reflected a broader culture of preparedness. Here, stone was not for intimidation, it was for stability. The best castles, the old lords used to say, were those that never had to be used. Taikta was such a castle built to watch, to wait, and to survive. The coming of the Sengoku. In the late 15th and 16th centuries, the peaceful purpose of mountain castles was tested. Japan plunged into the Sengoku period, an age of near-constant civil war, where alliances shifted as quickly as seasons, and loyalty was often a matter of survival. Taikta, though relatively small, was drawn into this turbulence. The Adagaki family, caretakers of the fortress under the Yamana clan, found themselves caught between loyalties. The Yamana themselves were in decline, challenged by rising powers such as the Oda, Mori, and eventually Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The castle, once a quiet watcher of valleys, now watched the approach of war. Unresolved thought. And so, as the fog wraps the broken walls of Taikta each morning, and tourists walk where guards once stood, we are left to wonder. Is the strength of a fortress found in its battles, or in the centuries it never had to fight at all? The quiet before the storm. By the early 1500s, Japan was sliding into the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. For over a century, regional warlords fought bitterly for territory, loyalty, and control of the weakening shogunate. Castles became more than watchpoints, they became centers of power and symbols of ambition. For Taikta Castle, built in the remote folds of the Hyogo Highlands, this meant a change in tempo. It would not remain untouched. Originally under the Yamana clan's rule, Taikta served as an outpost in a network of Western Japan's military infrastructure. But the Yamana were weakening. Internal strife, poor alliances, and the rise of more aggressive daimyo slowly reduced their reach. Into this power vacuum stepped a man named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of the most capable and ambitious figures in Japanese history. And his eyes, eventually, turned toward Taikta. The rise of Hideyoshi. Born a peasant in 1537, Hideyoshi rose through cunning and charisma, becoming a general under Oda Nobunaga, Japan's unifier. After Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi continued the campaign of consolidation, seeking to neutralize local powers and bring the country under one rule. His method was simple: ally, absorb, or crush. The western provinces, including the territory around Taikta, were part of his military campaign. In 1577, Hideyoshi was appointed by Nobunaga to subdue the Chugoku region. This brought his army into Harima province, near the strategic Akuno silver mines, which lay within a few days' march of Taikta Castle. For Taikta, now under the leadership of the Adagaki family, the stakes were clear: surrender peacefully or face destruction. Taikta under attack. In 1577, Hideyoshi moved swiftly, attacking Yamana outposts throughout the region. It's unclear exactly when Taikta was captured. Some accounts suggest it fell without a fight, its defenders choosing withdrawal over resistance. If so, it would have been a practical decision. Taikta Castle was defensible but not invincible. Its steep paths, narrow access, and high walls could repel small forces, but Hideyoshi commanded thousands, and more importantly, controlled supply lines and loyalty from surrounding territories. By 1580, the entire region was under Toyotomi rule. The Adagaki family's role ended, and control of Taikta passed to Hirohide Akamatsu, a loyal officer under Hideyoshi, whose task was to modernize and manage the fortress. Hirohide in the final years. Akamatsu Hirohide was not a famous general. His name appears rarely in records, but for nearly 2 decades he governed Taikta and its surrounding lands, overseeing the maintenance of the castle, tax collection, and local peacekeeping. Unlike earlier lords, Hirohide's role was more administrative. Japan was stabilizing, at least temporarily. Hideyoshi's military success brought a period of enforced calm. Castles like Taikta became centers of logistics, not just defense. Hirohide made modest upgrades to Takeda's infrastructure. He is credited with reinforcing stonework and possibly expanding storage areas within the baileys. But the era of mountain castles was already beginning to fade. The new trend was toward flatland castles Hurigiro, closer to roads, rivers, and commerce. These were easier to supply, to populate, and to show off. In the growing peace, visibility became more important than concealment. Takeda, with its fog-wrapped ridges, was becoming an outdated solution to an old problem. The Battle of Sekigahara. Everything changed in 1600. Following Hideyoshi's death in 1598, a fierce succession crisis split the nation between the Toyotomi loyalists and the emerging power of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would soon found Japan's final shogunate. This culminated in the decisive Battle of Sekigahara, a massive clash that shaped the next 250 years of Japanese history. Hirohide Akamatsu, Lord of Takeda, sided with the losing faction, the Western Army loyal to the Toyotomi. And though Takeda played no direct role in the battle, Hirohide's fate was sealed. He was accused of setting fire to Tottori Castle in a desperate military maneuver that caused civilian casualties, an act frowned upon even in wartime. His punishment was swift and absolute, seppuku ritual suicide. With his death, Takeda Castle was abolished, ordered to be dismantled by the victorious Tokugawa regime. Like many mountain castles after Sekigahara, it was deemed strategically obsolete and politically inconvenient. And so, after more than 150 years, the castle in the clouds fell quietly, without battle, by bureaucratic decree. A slow collapse. The castle wasn't destroyed by violence or time, it was left behind. The wooden structures were dismantled, roof tiles were removed, staircases pulled apart. The stone walls, too massive to carry away, remained. Over the decades, grass took root in the crevices, trees sprouted in courtyards, the terraces softened, birds nested in old lookout posts. But the fog still came, and the castle bare of roofs and watchtowers still rose through the mist. Villagers below, now governed from newer towns in the valley, referred to it as the Old Mountain Stones. Children climbed it in summer. Shepherds grazed animals on its lower slopes. No armies ever came again. A memory forgotten, then found. For centuries, Takeda Castle faded from maps, from attention, and nearly from memory. It wasn't until the 20th century, particularly the post-war period, that interest in Takeda revived. Archaeologists began mapping the ruins. Restoration efforts stabilized collapsed sections. Tourists drawn by photographs of the site peeking through clouds arrived in small groups, then larger ones. By the 1990s, it had earned its nickname, Japan's Machu Picchu, a name not entirely accurate but useful. Yet Takeda remains strikingly quiet. There are no shops at the top, no souvenir booths. The final ascent must be done on foot. Signs ask for silence. And when you reach the top, the air feels thin, not from altitude, but from the weight of time. The echo of duty. Today, Takeda Castle is a ruin, but a complete ruin not just in stone, but in story. It stands not as a monument to war, but as a reminder of a functional past. Of messengers running up switchbacks. Of guards watching valleys through fog. Of villagers drying grain below the walls. Of commanders reading letters by candlelight. The kind of past that doesn't make headlines, but without which empires would never have functioned. Unresolved thought. And so, standing atop Mount Kojo, where cold wind slides over worn stones, you might ask, did Takeda Castle fall, or did the world simply move on without it? A fortress with no enemy. Today, Takedajo is a ruin, but not the kind left by fire or conquest. It is a ruin by absence, by the slow erosion of relevance. No climactic battle ever breached its walls. No siege ever toppled its stones. It did not fall. It was simply unneeded, and so it faded. But in fatting, it found something else: endurance. For over 400 years, the skeleton of Take the Castle has remained. No roof, no tower, just platforms, terraces, and walls, a fortress whose value lies not in dominance, but in resilience through stillness. And perhaps that's what makes Take the more enduring than any golden keep or grand palace. It is honest. It reflects the truth of most history, not defined by decisive moments, but by long periods of quiet responsibility, of watching and waiting. Stones that remember. The walls that remain atop Mount Kojo are modest, but they are deliberate. Each stone was placed by hand, without mortar, without machinery, just muscle, logic, and necessity. They have withstood earthquakes, storms, and time. No ornate flourishes, no vanity, just the strength of careful alignment. When you walk along these walls, you do not see inscriptions. You see the scars of function, drainage grooves, foundation holes for wooden buildings now long gone, the remnants of earthen paths that once carried supplies from bailey to bailey. There's something beautiful in their restraint, as though the builders never expected the castle to last this long, but built it as well as they could anyway. The view that once mattered. From the top of Take-Da, the view is vast. You can see across the Wadiyama Basin, with its patchwork of rice paddies and tiled roofs. In autumn, the entire valley fills with fog, turning the world below into a white sea. From above, it feels like a castle floating on clouds. This view, once strategic, used to monitor enemy movement, trade routes, and weather shifts, is now aesthetic, but it still holds power. Local villagers speak of the view with reverence, not because of any historical event, but because it reminds them of rhythm, of change, of the slow, patient climb required to reach something meaningful. The return of the people. Though the castle was abandoned in 1600, the land around it was never truly empty. The town of Asego remained below. For centuries, it existed as a small farming community, largely removed from Japan's urban sprawl. The people worked the land that once fed the fortress. They did not forget the castle, but they did not glorify it either. It was part of the landscape, a place for children to explore, a marker of the seasons. In spring, it became a backdrop for plum blossoms, in autumn for mist. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the people of Asego began to realize that what they had overlooked was rare. A nearly intact mountain castle layout with original stone walls untouched by modern reconstruction. Now, local volunteers assist with preservation efforts, guided tour, and cleaning the trails. School groups hike the path each year to learn about their region's history, not through samurai tales, but through the everyday reality of survival. The cost of being seen. As Take-Da has grown in popularity, especially on social media and in travel publications, the site has faced a new kind of pressure: overexposure. The fog photos, gorgeous and surreal, have drawn thousands, but this sudden attention strains the fragile stone paths. In response, the town introduced timed entry tickets, staffed gates, and strict no-drone policies to protect the atmosphere. The irony is sharp. A place built to be hidden must now be managed to remain hidden. And so, the very thing that kept Take-Da preserved for centuries, its remoteness, is now its greatest challenge. Preservation through patience. But Take-Da has one enduring advantage: it is not easy to reach. To visit Take-Da Castle today, you must climb on foot, often for 20-30 minutes up a stone-lined path called the Hyogo no Michi. It winds through forests, passing old markers and views of the valley. There are no escalators, no paved roads to the top. The hike becomes a filter only those willing to ascend slowly may enter. At the summit you find no gift shop, no food stall, just silence broken by wind, the occasional crow, and footsteps on gravel. The fog moves in tendrils, the air is cooler, and the view unchanged in centuries waits. It's not dramatic, but it's meaningful. echoes of those who waited. Though the historical records are thin, we know that Take the Castle held dozens of defenders, laborers, messengers, and planners at any given time. Not heroes, not famous, just people doing their jobs, repairing gates, storing grain, watching the tree line. It is their story, more than any lord's, that lingers in the stone. The story of men who stood post in snow for days with no attack, of cooks preparing soup in silence, of boys carrying baskets up the mountain, of guards writing reports by candlelight no one would ever read again. This is what remains in Takeda, the echo of duty without drama, a kind of history that mattered because it made bigger things possible even if it was never told. The true meaning of endurance. Take the Castle never housed an emperor, never hosted a coronation, never starred in a war chronicle, and yet it has outlasted most of its contemporaries. Why? Because it was built well, because it was used carefully, because it was left alone. In the rush of history, some places survive not by force but by waiting out the storm. Takeda is such a place. Its strength is not in what happened there but in how it held, how it watched, and how it continues to offer a lesson in slow resilience. Final reflection. So what is Take the Castle now? A ruin, a relic, a tourist site? Or is it something else, a place where what was ordinary became extraordinary through endurance, where the act of watching, waiting, and weathering proved more powerful than any battle? In a world that celebrates speed, perhaps the quiet persistence of Takeda, built in silence, abandoned in silence, and rediscovered in silence, offers us a different kind of heroism. One that doesn't conquer, but simply endures. Story 5. Montségur, the last Cathar stronghold. A fortress of the faithful. In the arid region of southern France, a limestone peak juts upward like a ship breaking the surface of the earth. Its summit is steep, narrow, and ringed with the ruin of stone walls, worn by centuries of wind. The site is Montségur, literally, safe mountain. But it was not always safe. In the 13th century, it became the last stronghold of the Cathars, a religious group labeled heretical by the Catholic Church, and hunted across Languedoc during the violent, slow-moving campaign known as the Albigensian Crusade. Montségur's story is not one of dynasties or conquest. It is the story of conviction in exile, of a community that climbed high not to dominate, but to survive, a story defined not by the clash of swords, but by the daily rituals of people trying to preserve their truth at the edge of a crumbling world. Who were the Cathars? To understand Montségur, we must understand the Cathars, a Christian sect with roots in dualist theology, who believed the world was a struggle between a good spiritual God and a lesser, evil material creator. To the Cathars, physical existence, wealth, flesh, property was impure. What mattered was spirit, simplicity, and asceticism. They rejected the Catholic sacraments, especially baptism and the Eucharist. They had no churches, no altars. Instead, they gathered in homes or outdoors. Their spiritual leaders, called prefecti, lived austere lives, celibate, vegetarian, nonviolent. But for all their simplicity, the Cathars represented a threat to the authority of the Church because they were organized, devout, and popular, especially among the nobility of southern France, who saw in them a counterweight to northern political and religious control. By the early 1200s, Cathars had become so widespread that Pope Innocent III declared a crusade not against Muslims, but against other Christians. It was the first time a crusade had been directed internally. The Albigensian Crusade. Launched in 1209, the Albigensian Crusade began with the sack of Béziers and spread through Carcassonne, Albi, Toulouse, and the rest of Occitania. Towns were burned. Suspected heretics were executed. Entire populations were punished for tolerating Catharism. The crusade was led by northern French barons, eager not just for spiritual merit, but for land and power. The region's culture, rich in poetry, tolerance, and local identity was slowly dismantled. By the 1230s, the movement had been forced underground, but one place remained untouched: Montségur, a nearly inaccessible mountain fortress far from the Crusaders' path. It would become the last refuge. The sacred peak. Montségur was not an invention of the Cathars. The site had been used since antiquity, first by the Romans, then by local lords as a watchpoint over the Languedoc valleys. Its summit, 1,200 meters above sea level, offered commanding views in every direction and could only be approached by narrow, winding trails. By 1204, the local noble, Raymond de Perret, had begun fortifying Montségur, possibly anticipating a time when his people would need sanctuary. In 1232, he allowed the Cathars to settle there. With his support and that of a few sympathetic lords, the mountaintop became a spiritual center and safe haven, not a fortress of war but of belief. Building the refuge. The Cathars did not build great cathedrals or stone temples, but at Montségur they built a functioning community, complete with homes, workshops, kitchens, and communal gathering spaces. They adapted the existing castle ruins and fortified them with stone. Walls were rebuilt, water cisterns dug, and wooden structures erected along the ridges. Stone steps were carved into the slope. There were no palaces, no armories in the traditional sense. What was defended was not territory but a way of life. Records, what few survive, suggest that as many as 500 people lived on the peak at one time. This included prefecti, soldiers, villagers, and noble families. They prayed, worked, read scripture, and received visitors from the valleys below. The community was governed not by a king, but by conviction, guided by the simple rules of Cathar conduct. They believed in non-possession, in truth-telling, in the avoidance of violence when possible. It was not idyllic. Food was scarce and winters were harsh. Water had to be carefully stored. Supply lines from sympathetic villages below were vulnerable. But for nearly a decade, Montségur endured in peace, a strange, high world above the chaos below. Life on the mountain. What did daily life look like on this sacred rock? Simple, communal, and constant in ritual. The prefecti, those who had undergone the consolamentum, or spiritual baptism, lived in pairs, often in small stone rooms with little more than a cot, a table, and scripture. They ate only what was given. They walked barefoot. They worked and prayed together. Laypeople called credents lived more flexible lives, raising animals, collecting firewood, cooking meals. Children learned both Cathar doctrine and practical survival: how to stretch wool, dry meat, store nuts and herbs, maintain tools. The community was supported by a few noble patrons, Raymond de Perret and his cousin Pierre Roger de Mirepoix, who organized the defense of the mountain. But their authority was not absolute. The spiritual heart of Montségur was the belief shared by all that purity came through rejection of the corrupt world. It was a society of endurance, lived in the rhythm of the sky. When fog rolled in from the valleys, they saw it not as danger but as a veil of protection. When snow fell, they gathered close. When sun struck the limestone too hot, they retreated into the shadows. They did not seek battle, but they prepared with discipline, routine, and quiet resolve. The inquisitors take notice. For a time, the church tolerated Montségur's existence, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps because of its remoteness. But as Catharism showed signs of revival elsewhere, Montségur became a target. By the late 1230s, Pope Gregory IX ordered the reinvigoration of the Inquisition, and Montségur was identified as a symbolic stronghold of heresy. It was not just a refuge, it was a message that Catharism was not defeated. In 1243, a combined force of French royal troops and church-approved crusaders, under the leadership of Seneschal Hugues des Arcis, marched toward Montségur. They came not to debate, but to eradicate. The siege begins. In May 1243, the siege began. Montséguer's defenders numbered perhaps 100 fighting men, enough to delay but not repel. They were not a professional army, but villagers, nobles, and a few trained guards. They used the terrain to their advantage, rolling boulders, firing arrows, burning brush to obscure the few approaches. The attackers established camps along the ridgelines, slowly moving artillery into place. It was a slow siege, months of stalemate, with brief skirmishes and constant pressure. The defenders held through autumn, then winter. But by early March 1244, with supplies low and morale faltering, they were forced to negotiate. Unresolved thought. So as the smoke of watchfires curled above the stone terraces, and Cathar believers prepared for the choice that lay ahead, one might wonder, was Montségur a failure of resistance, or the last success of belief lived fully, even to the end? The long siege ends. By early March of 1244, after nearly 10 months of siege, Montségur stood on the edge of collapse. The snow had come and gone. The food stores, dried meat, hard cheese, grain had dwindled to almost nothing. Water had to be boiled from melting snow. Every day brought more sickness, hunger, and wear. No reinforcements came. The Crusader camp, by contrast, was well supplied. They had slowly advanced siege engines to firing range. Boulders cracked the outer walls. Archers kept defenders from venturing far. Their goal wasn't to storm the castle, it was to wear it down, to let despair do the work. Inside, the defenders faced an impossible decision. They could fight to the last or negotiate terms. The latter won. In early March, talks began between Pierre Roger de Mirepoix, commander of Montségur, and Seneschal Hugues des Arcis, leader of the siege. The Cathars knew what surrender meant. Their beliefs were heresy, but there were civilians, children, elderly, tradespeople on the mountain. To fight would mean slaughter. And so terms were agreed upon. The Truce of Montségur. What came next was unusual. The attackers granted a 2-week truce, a delay before final surrender. The reason remains debated. Some say it was due to religious customs of Lenten fasting. Others suggest practical issues, a need to build the execution site, or perhaps an attempt to allow those inside one last chance to renounce their faith. Regardless of the reason, the 2 weeks passed in eerie calm. No further attacks, no escape attempts, just waiting. During this time, some within Montségur recanted. According to Catholic sources, over 200 people accepted absolution from the church. They would be spared, allowed to return to the world below physically, if not spiritually, unchanged. But others did not. According to multiple accounts, 225 individuals, men and women, young and old, chose to remain Cathars, to stand by the perfecti and face the consequences. A fire without struggle. On March 16, 1244, Montségur fell. There was no battle, no gates smashed, no swords drawn. The doors were opened. The Crusaders entered. A list was taken. Those who had recanted were spared. The rest, Cathar perfecti and their followers, were taken into custody, led down the mountain to a nearby field at the base. There, a large wooden structure had been built. It was not a pyre in the typical sense. Rather, it was an enclosure of dry wood, open at the top. The condemned were led inside. Eyewitness reports suggest that no one resisted, no one screamed. They sang hymns as the flames rose. This is known as the Montségur martyrdom. 225 people burned alive, not for revolt, but for believing differently and refusing to speak the words required to save their lives. There were no trials, no records of defense, just conviction followed by execution. The silence after. When the flames died, Montségur was empty. The church ordered the demolition of its structures, though the stone base walls too heavy to remove remained. The summit was left unoccupied, stripped of meaning by fire and decree. The land returned to the wind. For a time, Catharism survived in secret, in whispers across the valleys, in coded texts and hidden rites. But by the 14th century, it was largely gone from the landscape. Yet the story of Montsager did not disappear. It lingered in folk songs, oral traditions, and eventually, scholarship. It became symbolic not just of Cathar faith, but of resistance to enforced conformity, of people choosing truth over safety. The practical life on the peak. What's often lost in retellings of Montsager is the everyday labor that made its last stand possible. Cathar Perfecti may have been spiritual leaders, but Montsager was also a functioning settlement. The people who lived there kept fires burning, cisterns filled, livestock fed, bread baked, and children clothed. During the siege, guards stood hour-long watches, often freezing in thin tunics. Cooks rationed dwindling supplies, stretching meals with wild herbs and whatever small game could be snared. Letters were likely burned to avoid capture. Tools were sharpened at night. Everyone took turns hauling water and clearing snow from paths. Candles were hoarded, reused, and rewicked. These small acts of survival were never chronicled, but they made the greater act refusing to recant all the more powerful. It is one thing to die for belief. It is another to live for it first, for months on end in hardship. What was preserved? Strangely, the Cathars left behind almost no physical texts. Their teachings were largely oral. What we know comes from Inquisition records, written by their enemies. But from these sources and from the behavior at Montsager, we can gather the central themes. The rejection of violence and vengeance. The belief that God did not rule the material world. The idea that one could live purely through discipline and humility. That faith did not require churches, only community and practice. At Montsager, they lived this quietly. No revolts, no conquest, just a mountain and a commitment to remain as they were, no matter the cost. The view today. Today, Montsager is a ruin but a visible one. Visitors climb a winding path from the valley, often taking 30-45 minutes to reach the summit. The walls, partial but present, outline the old fort, stones warmed by the sun. The view stretches for miles over forest, field, and stream. There is no chapel, no signage telling you what to think. Just open air, the whisper of wind, and a faint echo of choice. Each year on March 16, a small gathering meets below the peak near the site of the martyrdom. Flowers are laid, candles lit, silence held, not in triumph but in respect for those who chose their truth without spectacle. Montsager's echoes. Some have mythologized the site, linking it to the Holy Grail, to esoteric secrets, to grand theories. But perhaps that distracts from its real legacy. Montsager reminds us that history is not only written by the victors sometimes. It is held by those who leave no book behind, only a decision. It's the kind of history that exists in ruins, not monuments. That speaks softly, not through trumpets, but through stone warmed by centuries, and the memory of people who chose to be forgotten rather than false. Unresolved thought. So one must ask, standing on the sacred peak, was the real power of Montsager found in its walls, or in the quiet resolve of those who let the fire come and never looked away? A ruin without a resurrection. After the mass burning of March 1244, Montsager faded from history's direct concern. The fortress was partially dismantled. Its defenders and community were gone. Catharism, once vibrant and widespread across southern France, was effectively extinguished not in a moment, but in slow, relentless pressure, village by village, word by word. Montsager became a place without a purpose. The wind returned to its ridges. Grass grew in the cracks between the stones. The path up the mountain narrowed to a trail walked only by shepherds and occasional wanderers. For nearly 500 years, it was left to time. But even as the world changed, nations rose, languages shifted, kings were crowned, Montsager remained. And in doing so, it became more than a castle. It became a memory that refused to leave. The long sleep. Unlike grand cathedrals or royal palaces, Montségur was not restored. There were no funds for reconstruction, no monuments built by victorious armies. It was allowed to erode naturally, a fitting fate, perhaps, for a community that believed the material world was illusion. Over time, legends grew. Locals whispered that strange lights flickered over the summit at night, that the wind carried songs in a language no one spoke anymore, that a treasure had been buried before the surrender books, or perhaps something more. The Cathar Grail theory, proposed much later in the 19th and 20th centuries, claimed that Montségur had been the final hiding place of an object of spiritual power. There is no evidence for this, but the very persistence of the theory speaks to something true. That Montségur became a symbol of hidden knowledge, of resistance through retreat, of faith that chose fire over falsehood. Rediscovery. In the 19th century, French historians and poets began to explore Cathar history in earnest. The Romantic movement, which loved ruins, martyrdom, and doomed causes, found Montségur irresistible. Writers like Napoleon Peyrat described the site in reverent, mystical tones. His works blended fact and myth, presenting the Cathars as pure, noble, and misunderstood, a spiritual counterpoint to the authoritarian church. Though his interpretations were not always historically rigorous, they revived interest in the site. Archaeologists followed. In the 20th century, excavations uncovered tools, coins, ceramics, and foundation stones, confirming the scale of the community that once lived atop the peak. They found no treasure, no sacred relics, only the artifacts of real life. Whetstones, cooking pots, charcoal traces, scraps of iron blades, ordinary things, survivals of survival. Pilgrimage in silence. Today, Montségur is not a church. It is not a shrine in the formal sense, and yet pilgrimage happens. Every year people climb its path, some for history, some for peace, some without knowing exactly why. The path remains steep, winding through oak and pine, with the valley falling away behind you and the final ascent opening into sky. At the summit there are no pews, no altars, just stone platforms, rough walls, and a near uninterrupted horizon. If the wind is right, you can hear your breath. You can hear the air itself. On March 16, a small group of visitors, sometimes descendants of the old Occitan lineages, gather in silence at the field below the fortress, where the burning took place. No speeches, no spectacle, just memory. The act of remembering becomes the only monument. What Montségur stands for now. To historians, Montségur is a rare example of a spiritual community taking physical form not to conquer, but to preserve an idea. Its walls were not designed to house treasure, but to shelter belief. To locals, it's a landmark, a point of orientation, a place that grounds their cultural identity not in nationalism, but in regional memory, in language Occitan, and in the idea that not all traditions come from the centers of power. To many visitors, Montségur offers something harder to name. Perhaps it is the feeling of the past watching you, not in grandeur, but in persistence. The knowledge that 225 people once stood here, ordinary people, and chose silence and flame over saying words they did not believe. And to some, it is simply this: a place that reminds us that history is made as much by the quiet as by the loud. Endurance without reward. Unlike political revolutions or military victories, Montségur left no successors. Its defenders died. Its ideas faded from public practice. It did not change the course of the world. But perhaps that's the wrong measure. Montségur shows us what it means to stand still when the world demands movement, to remain who you are when compromise would bring safety, to find dignity not in triumph but in consistency. These are not glamorous things. They are not thrilling, but they are the root of something deeper, the belief that the interior life matters, even in the face of fire. Echoes in the modern world. In an age of information where belief is often molded by speed, Montsager offers the opposite. It asks, what does it mean to live according to a truth that costs you? What are we willing to give up to belong? And what do we hold on to, even when no one else understands? The Cathars left few words behind, but Montsager still speaks through stone, silence, and the long breath of wind over the Pyrenees. It speaks not loudly, not clearly, but steadily. Final reflection. So as you descend the mountain, leaving the ruined fortress behind, you might ask, if belief costs us nothing, was it ever belief at all? And if we let go of the things that root us, will anything remain standing centuries from now, the way Montsager still does? Story 6. Craggy Isolation, the Walled Secrets of Masada. A mountain without mercy. Far from the green hills of Europe or the river-fed cities of Rome, there lies a mountain shaped like a fist. Flat-topped, sheer-sided, and dry as bone, Masada rises over 400 meters above the Judean desert floor, a stone island in a sea of silence. Even from a distance, it looks defiant, untouched, unreachable, and utterly alone. Here, more than 2,000 years ago, two very different chapters of history were written. One by Herod the Great, who turned the summit into a desert palace, and another by a band of Jewish rebels, who made it their final stand in one of the most tragic and symbolic episodes of ancient resistance. But first, before the revolt and the fall, there was a vision, Herod's vision. Herod the Builder. Herod the Great, king of Judea under Roman patronage from 37 to 4 BCE, was a man obsessed with architecture and security. He was a master of ambition and paranoia, a ruler who expanded Jerusalem's temple, built Caesarea's harbor, and fortified cities across the land. But Masada was different. It was not built for display. It was not made to host festivals or impress visitors. It was a desert citadel designed to survive. Herod did not create Masada from nothing. The plateau had likely been used centuries earlier as a military outpost, but it was Herod who transformed it between 37 and 31 BCE into a self-contained mountain fortress, capable of withstanding siege and isolation for years. Why? Because Herod, despite his power, trusted no one. Not Rome, not his family, not his subjects. Masada was his fallback plan, a place to flee if everything else collapsed. Building on the edge. Constructing on Masada's summit was no small task. Everything stone, timber, plaster, water jars, food supplies had to be carried up its steep flanks by human or animal labor. The site receives almost no rain, and the sun bakes the stone for most of the year. Yet Herod's engineers succeeded. They carved out a network of palaces, storerooms, walls, towers, and cisterns. 2 palaces stood atop the mountain, one at the northern tip, designed in 3 tiers, overlooking the sheer cliff like a bird's beak. There were massive storage halls, lined with ceramic jars once filled with grain, wine, dried fruits, and oil. Cisterns cut into the rock collected rainwater from flash floods, then channeled it through aqueducts. Even baths, Roman style, with hot and cold rooms, were built for Herod's use, fueled by furnaces and tiled with imported materials. From atop Masada, Herod could see the desert for miles, and the Dead Sea shimmered in the distance like a mirror to the void. A fortress without comfort. Despite the engineering marvel, Masada was not a palace of pleasure. It was a place of fear, a place of last resort. Herod never made it his primary residence. He rarely visited. It was meant to be ready not for rule, but for retreat. Its high walls were a declaration. If the world turns on me, I will still stand here. And perhaps that's what makes Masada so different from other historical monuments. It was not designed for celebration or ceremony. It was a plan for disaster, built in the expectation of betrayal. mountain fortress not above the clouds, but above trust itself. The empire shifts. When Herod died in 4 BCE, Masada passed to his successors. Then, over the following decades, Judea saw a slow-burning crisis. Corruption, taxation, religious tension, and Roman interference sparked growing unrest. By 66 CE, this unrest exploded into the First Jewish-Roman War, also known as the Great Revolt. Jerusalem burned, Roman legions marched, rebels took to the hills. And among them, a radical group emerged, the Sicarii. They would be the ones to bring Masada back from silence. The Sicarii, knives and names. The Sicarii, named after the short daggers they carried, were extremists by any measure. They opposed not only the Romans, but also any Jews who collaborated with them. To them, survival meant total resistance, even if that meant isolation, violence, or death. In 66 or 67 CE, a group of Sicarii, led by Eleazar ben Yair, fled the chaos of the uprising and seized Masada from the small Roman garrison stationed there. They knew of Herod's stores: grain, oil, weapons, and water still sealed and usable. The fortress was ready-made for rebellion. Masada became their mountain of defiance. Life on the summit. For the next several years, the Sicarii lived atop Masada. Their numbers likely included men, women, and children. Historians estimate around 960 people in total. They lived as fugitives, but they built a society. Using Herod's storerooms, they ate, drank, stored fuel. They baked bread, used the bathhouses, repaired the walls, and prayed in simple rooms carved from stone. Their days were not glorious. They were marked by fear, ritual, and resolve. The Sicarii conducted raids on nearby villages, sometimes attacking Jewish communities who had aligned with Rome. These acts, brutal as they were, show the extent to which ideology had hardened. To the Sicarii, there was no middle ground, only freedom or submission. And so they watched the desert horizon, waiting for the legions to come. Rome responds. By 70 CE, Jerusalem had fallen. The second temple center of Jewish religious life was destroyed. The war was, for all intents and purposes, over. But Masada still stood. And for Rome, this final outpost of resistance could not be allowed to remain. In 72 or 73 CE, the Roman governor of Judea, Lucius Flavius Silva, arrived at Masada with the 10th Legion. Over 8,000 soldiers surrounded the base of the mountain. The Sicarii were now fewer than 1,000, but they had the high ground. The cliffs of Masada were steep, its walls strong. It would be another siege. The long wait. The Romans set up camps around the base of the mountain, 8 of them. Their remains still visible today. They built a massive circumvallation wall, a perimeter barrier to ensure no one escaped. Then came the engineering. Over months, Roman soldiers, likely aided by enslaved labor, constructed a massive siege ramp on the western side, the only slope where such a feat was possible. Layer by layer, stones and earth were heaped to build a path high enough to reach the walls. It was slow, methodical, and crushing in its inevitability. Inside Masada, the Sicarii watched. They knew what was coming. They had stores, water, shelter, but they had no exit. And the ramp rose, 1 foot at a time. Unresolved thought. So as dust settled on the silent summit, and the long shadows of the Roman war machine stretched upward, one must wonder. In the face of certain conquest, is endurance enough? Or must survival sometimes give way to something else, something final? The earth rises. By early 73 CE, the massive siege ramp the Romans were building on the western slope of Masada was nearing completion. Constructed with stones, wooden supports, and packed earth, it climbed slowly over 100 meters in height, broad enough to support a siege tower and battering ram. The defenders, from their stone parapets high above, could do little to stop it. The angle was too wide, the laborers were too many, And worst of all, they could watch it happen day after day like an hourglass counting down in reverse. Inside the fortress, Eleazar ben Yair and his followers tightened their defenses. They reinforced the western wall, dug fire trenches, stockpiled oil, rocks, and spears. But they knew just as surely as they knew the desert sun the wall would fall. The Roman machine. Lucius Flavius Silva, the Roman general, was not hasty. The ramp was a statement of Rome's reach, of Rome's discipline, and of Rome's intent. His troops, including engineers and auxiliaries, worked methodically. The Roman camps, laid out in the classic quadrilateral pattern, formed a noose around the mountain. The circumvallation wall ensured no escape. Water was brought by mule, supplies from nearby towns. The desert was inhospitable, but the legions thrived on order and time. There were no negotiations, no envoys. Masada had become more than a military target, it was a symbol. The war was won. Jerusalem was destroyed, but this defiant outcrop stood as a thorn in the imperial image. Rome would not leave it untamed. Inside the fortress walls, within the stone perimeter of Masada, the 960 inhabitants faced a siege of the mind more than of weapons. Among them were men, women, and children, some born on the mountain, others who had climbed it in desperation years earlier. Their daily lives, already austere, narrowed further. Watches were doubled, rations reduced, meetings held by firelight. The Sicarii were zealots, but they were not oblivious. They knew what the Romans did to rebels: slavery, crucifixion, parade through Rome as spoils. There would be no quarter and no second chance. And so, a question unspoken at first began to surface among the defenders. If surrender meant erasure, what did resistance mean? A desert of choice. For the families at Masada, time slowed. By now, years had passed since they had seen another town, another path, another way of life. The children knew no world but the rock and sky. The older ones remembered the cities and synagogues, but only in fragments. The final siege, then, was not only military, it was philosophical. What did it mean to be free when all choices narrowed to death or captivity? The Sicaria's worldview allowed no compromise. To them, God was not found in the temples of Rome, but in the act of total defiance. Even death, they believed, could be an act of spiritual purity. And still they sharpened blades, watched the ramp, waited. The final push. According to the ancient historian Flavius Josephus, a Jewish general turned Roman chronicler, the Romans completed their siege ramp in the spring of 73 CE. They wheeled forward a massive siege tower, fitted with a battering ram, and positioned it at the head of the ramp. With it, they began to pound the western wall. The defenders responded with burning pitch, stones, and whatever weapons remained. But it was not enough. The Romans had momentum, height, and the benefit of months of preparation. By evening, the outer wall cracked. The Romans withdrew, preparing to storm the fortress at dawn. Masada had one night left. A council in the darkness. That night, inside the fortress, Eleazar ben Yair gathered his people. What followed again, according to Josephus, was one of history's most unsettling moments of collective decision. Eleazar spoke of dignity, of freedom, of refusing to let their wives and children become slaves, of choosing death on their own terms rather than submission to Rome. He invoked examples from Jewish scripture: Saul falling on his sword, martyrs of earlier revolts, heroes who refused to worship foreign gods. And he proposed what few could imagine: that the community would kill their own families, then each other, until the final man took his own life. According to Josephus, this was debated fiercely but with resolve. The alternative was unbearable. Rome would not see them broken. Rome would see them gone. And so, with solemnity and silence, the plan was accepted. The final act. Again, if Josephus is to be believed, The following events unfolded in the quietest horror. 10 men were chosen by lot to carry out the task. The rest of the men killed their own wives and children, so they would not be taken. The 10 men then killed the others. One man, the last, set fire to the storerooms and living quarters except the food reserves, left intact as proof that this was not a death from desperation, but a deliberate choice. Then he took his life. When the Romans breached the walls the next morning, they found the fortress burning, the defenders dead, and only a few survivors, 2 women and 5 children, who had hidden in a cistern and lived to tell the tale. The silence that remained. The Romans did not celebrate. There were no prisoners to parade, no treasures to seize. Masada offered only ashes, corpses, and stone. Silva claimed the fortress for the empire, but there was no triumph, just silence, just the sound of the wind scraping over the cliff's edge. The name Masada Fortress remained, but it became something else. A place where people chose what they believed was freedom, even when the world would call it defeat. Unresolved thought. So as the ramp still rises beneath the cliffs, and the wind still howls across the blackened stones, one must wonder, is the power of resistance found in the act itself, or in the memory that refuses to fade, long after all voices have gone silent? A fortress left empty. When the Roman forces of Lucius Flavius Silva finally entered Masada in the spring of 73 or 74 CE, they found no battle to win, no victory to seize. The defenders were gone not by defeat but by design. The granaries were full. The cisterns held water. The fortress, though scorched, was not starved or broken. Masada had not fallen. It had been abandoned to death. The Romans raised their banners, claimed the mountaintop, and then moved on. Masada was never again a seat of power. No governor ruled from its summit. No garrison made it their permanent post. Over time, the desert winds swept its stones clean. The walls remained, but the story sank into quiet dust. The long sleep of Masada. For nearly 2 millennia, Masada lay dormant. Occasionally noted by travelers or scholars, it was mostly forgotten by the world. The path to the summit was steep, the terrain unforgiving. The desert sun turned the rock white by day and cold by night. Even the name Masada faded from common use. But the story lingered, preserved in the works of one man, Flavius Josephus, the former rebel-turned-Roman chronicler. His account, The Jewish War, included the dramatic final scene at Masada I filled with rhetoric, speeches, and tragic resolve. Some believed him. Others questioned the details. Still others doubted whether such a mass suicide could have truly occurred. Yet in absence of other records, his version endured. Masada remained in shadow, part ruin, part legend. The reawakening. In the 19th century, explorers and scholars began to rediscover the site in earnest. German and American archaeologists documented the ruins. The vast siege ramp was still visible, carved into the slope. The outlines of Roman camps remained, etched into the plain like ancient tattoos. But it was in the 20th century, particularly after the founding of the modern state of Israel in 1948, that Masada re-entered public consciousness as something more than just a ruin. It became a symbol, a national myth. For many Israelis, Masada came to represent not only the ancient struggle against Roman oppression, but the broader Jewish history of resilience, exile, and return. In the early years of the state, Israeli soldiers climbed Masada by night and took oaths at sunrise. Masada shall not fall again. The fortress became a site of pilgrimage, not for religion but for remembrance. School groups hiked the Snake Path. Memorials were held. The stone walls, once soaked in ash, now stood as monuments to willpower, identity, and national rebirth. And yet, with reverence came complexity. The weight of memory. Historians began to re-examine the story. They questioned, Did the mass suicide truly happen, as Josephus described? Was Eleazar ben Yair's speech real, or Romanized drama? Could the few survivors have been the only witnesses, and how did Josephus know what they saw? No archaeological evidence definitively confirms the suicide, though the site layout does align with many elements of the story. What remains undeniable, however, is the intentional legacy left behind. Food stores left untouched. Structures deliberately torched. A choice made not in desperation, but in clarity. Masada, whether precisely as Josephus wrote or not, became a metaphor, and metaphors, once seeded, grow into forests of belief. The desert fortress today. Now Masada is among Israel's most visited historical sites. A cable car carries visitors from the Dead Sea Valley to the summit. For those willing, the Snake Path, a winding, exposed trail, offers the original climb, still exhausting in the heat. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserved for its archaeology and layered meaning. Restored buildings like Herod's Northern Palace and the Roman-style bathhouse give visitors a sense of the scale and ambition that once animated this rock. Yet amid the plaques and pathways, the most powerful moments come in stillness. Standing by the cistern where survivors may have hidden, or overlooking the siege ramp, you don't hear the past, you feel its gravity. The wind blows as it did 2,000 years ago. The sun scorches the stones, and the silence asks questions no inscription ever can. A story of stillness. Masada's story, in the end, is not just about rebellion. It is about the end of rebellion, about what happens when all choices collapse into one final act. It speaks not only to freedom, but to the cost of absolute belief, to the tension between individual autonomy and collective survival, to the haunting idea that some mountains are built not for conquest, but for endings. And perhaps that is why Masada remains powerful, not because of the death, but because of the quietness with which it was accepted. Echoes beyond the desert. Across history, Masada's silence has resonated. In whispered comparisons to other final stands Montségur, Thermopylae, or the Alamo. In literature and film. In policy debates and cultural conversations. It has been praised, questioned, mourned, and mythologized. But always it lingers a mountain of questions in a land of answers. And for those who walk its paths today, the central dilemma remains. Was Masada a tragedy, a triumph, or both? Final reflection. So as you descend from the summit, where stone foundations hold more weight than walls, ask yourself, is it better to survive by compromise or to vanish by conviction? And if memory is all that remains, what responsibility do we have to carry it truthfully and carefully, so the mountain speaks not just of death, but of the quiet cost of freedom? Story 7. Castle Cock, the Sleeping Beauty of Victorian Wales. A castle in the canopy. Nestled among the beech trees of Forest Fawr, just north of Cardiff in Wales, stands a castle that seems as though it was pulled from the pages of a fairy tale. With its round red towers, conical slate roofs, arched windows, and ivy-draped stone, Castle Cock, meaning Red Castle, in Welsh, looks like it belongs in a fantasy novel. It's a fortress that beckons the imagination, perched just above the tree line like a secret the woods kept to themselves for centuries. But unlike other castles shaped by bloodshed and siege, Castle Cock was born from something quieter: longing, nostalgia, and artifice. Its story begins not in the mists of medieval Wales, but in the soot-swept industrial sprawl of Victorian Britain. Foundations of forgotten stone. Long before Castle Cock became a dreamlike Victorian folly, it was a real medieval fortress, and a forgotten one. Sometime after the Norman conquest of Britain, around the 11th or 12th century, the first version of the castle was likely built by the de Clare family, powerful Norman lords seeking to control the resource-rich lands of South Wales. The site was strategic. It overlooked the Taff Gorge, a key route between Cardiff and the Welsh valleys. Records are scarce. The original structure, probably made of earth and timber, typical of early Norman outposts, was likely destroyed and rebuilt multiple times during the Norman-Welsh border conflicts. By the 13th century, it was reconstructed in stone and used intermittently by the Marcher lords, but it never became a significant stronghold. It passed hands, faded from attention, and by the late Middle Ages, it had fallen into ruin. For centuries, the site was little more than a tumbled shell, covered in moss and shadowed by the deepening woods. But the bones of the place remained. The Age of Ruins. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, ruins became fashionable. Poets, painters, and aristocrats romanticized old castles and abbeys as symbols of a nobler past, especially in Wales, where nature and history tangled so vividly. Abandoned towers, crumbling arches, and ivy-covered walls came to represent melancholy beauty, a quiet resistance to the fast pace of industrial change. Castell Coch, in its ruined form, caught the attention of the Marquis of Bute, one of the richest and most powerful men in Britain. He had money, he had vision, and he had a singular architect in mind. Lord Bute and the Gothic Revival. John Crichton Stuart, the third Marquis of Bute, 1847–1900, was no ordinary aristocrat. He was a scholar, a mystic, and a deeply religious man who believed in the transformative power of architecture. He also happened to inherit immense wealth from his family's investments in the coal trade and the development of Cardiff docks, which became one of the busiest ports in the world. Lord Bute became fascinated with Gothic Revival architecture, a movement that sought to revive the styles and ideals of medieval Europe. In this, he found a kindred spirit in William Burgess, a brilliant but eccentric architect with a passion for fantasy and detail. Burgess, when presented with the ruins of Castell Coch in the 1870s, saw more than just stone. He saw a canvas. Building the dream. Between 1875 and 1891, Burgess and his team rebuilt Castell Coch not as a historically accurate fortress, but as a Victorian fantasy of the Middle Ages. The existing medieval stonework was incorporated, but everything else was transformed into a work of romantic imagination. The exterior was given dramatic conical towers, red sandstone walls, and heavy wooden doors. Inside, every room was lavished with detail. Walls painted with mythological creatures and saints. Ceilings paneled and painted with stars, vines, and flowers. Carvings of birds, monkeys, and allegorical symbols. Fireplaces sculpted like cathedral arches. Windows stained with medieval-style motifs. The ladies' bedroom was designed like a jewel box, with gold leaf detailing and a ceiling painted with constellations. The drawing room featured a fireplace decorated with scenes from Aesop's fables. Even the smallest spaces, servants' quarters, stairwells, were adorned with aesthetic care. Burgess described his approach as building a Middle Ages that never quite existed. It was, in essence, a dream made solid. A castle never meant for war. Despite its towering battlements and portcullis, Castell Coch was never intended to defend anything. The arrow slits were ornamental. The drawbridge was symbolic. The entire fortress was a theatrical set piece, created not for protection but for inspiration. It was rarely lived in. Lord Bute and his family used it as a retreat, a place to escape the noise of politics and industry, to immerse themselves in art, nature, and contemplation. Servants maintained it. Fires were kept lit. The furniture was ornate, though not always practical. Some rooms were rarely used. Others were opened only for visitors, scholars, artists, or trusted guests. Castell Coch became a castle of ideas rather than actions. A quietness unlike others. Unlike Montségur or Masada, Castle Cock's silence came not from tragedy or siege, but from deliberate stillness. It wasn't the site of last stands or martyrdoms. It was, instead, a place that embodied a very different kind of resilience, the quiet refusal to forget beauty, even in a modernizing world. As coal trains thundered through South Wales, and cities grew black with soot, this castle rose above the trees like a memory of something older, gentler, and imagined. And that may be what gives it power still today. Unresolved thought. So as the forest slowly reclaims its edges, and the painted ceilings fade ever so slightly with time, one might ask, is a castle less real if it never saw battle, or more real, because it gives form to a longing we all secretly carry? A castle of the mind. To walk through Castle Cock is to step inside an idea, crafted not by necessity, but by imagination. The castle is no reconstruction of a known past, it is a Victorian interpretation of what the medieval world should have been, filtered through the artistry of William Burgess and the romantic yearning of Lord Bute. The goal was not historical accuracy. The goal was symbolic truth, emotion, mystery, a return to the values and virtues Victorian Britain believed it had lost in the fire and smoke of industrial expansion. Each arch, each carving, each pane of stained glass was chosen to convey meaning, not just aesthetics. Castle Cock was a moral and artistic manifesto disguised as a fairy tale fortress. William Burgess, architect of dreams. William Burgess, 1827–1881, the architect responsible for Castle Cock, was a man deeply out of time. He adored the Middle Ages and sought not merely to replicate it, but to resurrect its spirit. He designed castles, cathedrals, furniture, jewelry, and clothing in medieval styles. But more than just forms, he wanted to revive the medieval worldview, one in which art, architecture, and belief were intertwined. Burgess' style was maximalist. He filled spaces with color, allegory, animals, Latin phrases, biblical motifs, and ornate furniture. He believed in total design, controlling every element from door hinges to bedposts to ensure cohesion of mood and message. In Castle Cock, he was given a rare gift: nearly unlimited budget, total creative control, and a patron who shared his vision. The result is one of the purest expressions of Gothic revival fantasy in Europe. The rooms themselves. Each room at Castle Cock is like entering a different world, carefully orchestrated to invoke emotional response and philosophical contemplation. The ladies' bedroom. Arguably the most famous room in the castle, it is a blend of starlight and sanctuary. The walls are painted in deep blue and gold, with constellations, roses, and doves swirling overhead. The circular room feels like a private chapel of the cosmos, where femininity is linked with cosmic harmony. The drawing room. Richly decorated with Aesop's fables, the room features carved animals acting out moral tales. The fireplace alone is a masterpiece. A monkey reads a book, a fox eyes a crow with cheese, and a lion dozes in the corner. It's playful, yes, but also a commentary on wisdom, deception, and consequence. The banqueting hall. Although never used for grand feasts, the room is decorated with images of justice, chivalry, and mythology. The ceiling beams are carved and painted, and the windows filter soft, stained light across emblems of kingship and virtue. Even stairwells and closets are adorned with careful detail: small animals, Latin inscriptions, patterns, and trim. Burgess left nothing blank because to him, beauty was a moral act. The role of nature. While the castle's design evokes grandeur and fantasy, its setting is equally vital to its power. Forest Fower, the ancient beechwood surrounding the castle, wraps it in green silence. Unlike castles that dominate their surroundings, Castle Cock appears to emerge from the forest part of it, not above it. From certain angles, the towers peak just above the treetops, like a vision half glimpsed in a dream. Mist often rolls in from the valleys below, adding to the sense of timelessness. Even the access road, winding through dense woods, delays the reveal of the castle. It's as though the site itself collaborates in maintaining the illusion of discovery. Function versus fantasy. Despite its grandeur, Castle Cock was never truly lived in. Lord Bute and his family visited occasionally, especially during the summer months, but it was not a primary residence. There were no great parties, no political functions, no royal guests. It was simply too remote, too small, and too delicate for the wear and tear of regular life. The castle was fully plumbed and wired, eventually, with Victorian conveniences but still impractical. It was less home than theater. In fact, parts of the castle were never fully completed. Burgess died in 1881 before all the interior work was done. Though his team carried on his vision, some rooms remained unfinished and the castle's use was limited. That perhaps was always the plan. Castle Cock was not meant to be used. It was meant to be felt. Public curiosity and shifting use. By the early 20th century, Castle Cock passed from the Bute family into public ownership. Slowly, it transformed from a private dream into a public treasure. It became a curiosity for locals and travelers, like a castle with no battles, a fortress that never fired a single arrow. Tourists came to see the fantasy made real. Over time, conservators restored its murals, preserved its furniture, and maintained the intricate detailing with painstaking care. The castle was officially open to the public, now under the stewardship of Cadwa, the Welsh Heritage Organization. It remains today a masterpiece of storytelling and architecture, not because of what it did, but because of what it tried to be. Echoes of a dream. In an age obsessed with utility, speed, and function, Castle Cock endures because it offers something deliberately impractical. It invites stillness, reflection, the luxury of wonder. It shows us that architecture can be not only shelter, but language, that beauty can be built for its own sake, that sometimes the walls we raise aren't to keep people out but to hold imagination in. In its quiet halls, amid carved monkeys and painted stars, a question remains. What parts of the past are we trying to resurrect, and are we reviving memory, or only our own myths? A castle without a chronicle. In the grand ledger of historical fortresses, Castle Cock is an anomaly. It has no famous siege. It has no legendary ruler. It marked no decisive turn in war, and it crowned no dynasty. And yet, its red towers and storybook profile have made it one of the most beloved castles in Wales, a structure that endures not because of what happened there, but because of what it makes us feel. In a world that often values function over feeling, Castle Cock remains a compelling reminder that beauty can be its own legacy. Architecture as autobiography. The castle, as completed by William Burgess and the third Marquess of Bute, was as much a self-portrait as it was a building. For Burgess, it was a last flourish, a final stage upon which to dramatize the themes that consumed him: religion, fantasy, myth, and medievalism. For Bute, it was a retreat into a more ordered and spiritually rich past, one imagined rather than remembered. Though built on medieval foundations, the castle became an emotional echo chamber reflecting the personal dreams of its creators, as well as the larger cultural yearnings of the time. It was a reaction to the 19th century, a moment when industrialization was accelerating, cities were expanding, and the past seemed to be slipping away. Castle Cock answered that anxiety not with resistance, but with re-enchantment. The myth of the Middle Ages. The Victorian era had a peculiar relationship with the medieval period. On one hand, they saw it as brutal, primitive, and superstitious. On the other, it was viewed as a golden age of chivalry, piety, and beauty. Burgess and Bute were clearly in the second camp. To them, the Middle Ages offered an escape, a place of meaning, of unity between faith and art, of purposeful design. Their version of the medieval world was cleaner, calmer, and more coherent than reality ever was. And that is the heart of Castle Cock's story. It does not represent the past as it was, but as Victorian Britain needed it to be: beautiful, noble, ordered, and above all, unchanging. In this way, Castle Cock is not a historical record, but a cultural mirror. A castle for the present. Today, visitors to Castle Cock come from all over the world. Some seek history, others seek photography. Many come simply because it looks like something from a storybook. Weddings are held beneath its towers. Schoolchildren tour its halls. Artists sketch the winding stairs and stained glass windows. Historians marvel at its construction. Others simply sit in the courtyard and listen to the wind move through the trees. But the most lasting experience of Castle Cock is quiet. It is not awe. It is not grandeur. It is gentle wonder, that rare feeling that something built with care and intention still speaks, even if the words have changed. Castle Cock in popular culture. As one might expect from such a visually striking building, Castle Cock has often appeared in film, television, and literature. It has doubled for everything from medieval castles to enchanted lairs. Its interiors, especially the ladies' bedroom and banqueting hall, have served as sets for period dramas and documentaries. But perhaps more telling than its screen presence is how often it appears in local lore. Folktales emerged in the 20th century, claiming the castle was haunted by the ghost of a cloaked monk or a sleeping princess. Local poets have written verses likening it to a jewel in the trees, a dream remembered too late. Children are told of its enchanted towers and of doors that only open for those with a pure heart. None of these tales are historical, but they are in their own way true. They speak to what Castle Cock became, a modern myth carefully constructed. The value of useless beauty. Perhaps what makes Castle Cock most interesting is how little practical use it ever had. It protected no kingdom. It controlled no trade route. It was never a home for more than a handful of days each year. And yet its creation demanded thousands of hours, careful planning, rare materials, and a level of artistic devotion that rivaled many national monuments. Why? Because not everything must serve a material purpose. Sometimes to build something beautiful is to make a moral statement, that life should contain moments of joy, elegance, and wonder, even if they offer no profit. In a way, Castle Cock stands as a rebuke to utilitarianism. It reminds us that a society that builds only what is necessary risks forgetting what is meaningful. A living metaphor. If Masada was a symbol of resistance and Montsegur of persecution, Castle Cock is a symbol of possibility. It shows what can happen when imagination is given a physical form, when two men, deeply absorbed in history and myth, decide to give shape to yearning. That may be why its nickname endures, the Sleeping Beauty Castle. Not because a princess lies within, but because it feels like a place where stories begin quietly, without urgency, without violence. Just a tower above the trees. A light seen through mist. A door that might open. Final reflection. So as you leave the painted halls and descend the winding road, ask yourself, what are we building today, not for function, but for memory? And when future generations look back, will they find anything that reflects not just how we lived, but how we dreamed? Story 8. Eagles' nests and alpine thrones, castles of the Bavarian high places. The allure of the high place. Mountains have always held a peculiar power over the human imagination. To ancient peoples, they were the realm of gods and spirits. To emperors, they were natural thrones, remote, majestic, symbolic. And for centuries, atop these crags and cliffs of southern Germany, The rulers of Bavaria looked up and saw not wilderness, but opportunity. From the forested shoulders of the Alps to the granite summits above tree line, castles rose not out of military necessity alone, but out of a desire to dominate the landscape with beauty, power, and symbolism. Some were fortresses in the truest sense. Others were palaces of performance, barely armed but rich in legend. And a few were hybrids of both, mixing practicality with theatricality. These were the castles of the Bavarian high places, and among them, none looms more famously or mysteriously than Neuschwanstein. The Bavarian frontier. Bavaria in the 19th century was a kingdom in transition. It had long been a powerful duchy within the Holy Roman Empire, and after Napoleon's reshuffling of Europe, it became an independent kingdom in 1806. With its pine forests, alpine lakes, and mountain ranges, it looked like a kingdom pulled from a Wagnerian opera which, as we shall see, would prove more prophetic than poetic. Politically, Bavaria was caught between modernization and romantic nationalism. While Germany moved toward unification under Prussian leadership, Bavaria's kings often found themselves nostalgic for older, more feudal ideals: knights, banners, faith, and the sacred bonds between monarch and land. Into this cultural atmosphere of longing and myth stepped a young king with a love of solitude, swans, and dreams. His name was Ludwig II. Ludwig II, the Swan King. Born in 1845, Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm was crowned King of Bavaria at just 18 years old. Sensitive, introverted, and imaginative, Ludwig found court politics draining and warlike Prussia distasteful. He preferred poetry, medieval romance, architecture, and music, particularly the operas of Richard Wagner, whose sweeping scores and mythical themes shaped Ludwig's worldview. He rarely attended to matters of state. Instead, he retreated mentally and physically into a world of castles. Over the course of his reign, Ludwig would commission several grand architectural projects, often at personal expense, and often to the concern of his ministers. He dreamed not of practical palaces or functional seats of power, but of fantasy, a revival of the idealized Middle Ages, filtered through Wagnerian drama and architectural bravado. At the heart of this dream was his most famous project, Schloss Neuschwanstein. The birth of Neuschwanstein. In 1868, Ludwig began planning a new castle near the ruins of Hohenschwangau, an earlier family residence nestled in the mountains near Füssen, close to the Austrian border. The site was steep, remote, and breathtaking, framed by the peaks of the Ammergebirge, with the Perlet Gorge cutting through rock and forest below. Construction began in 1869. But from the beginning, Neuschwanstein was not meant to be a typical royal residence. Ludwig described it in letters as a temple to friendship and a homage to Wagner, who had composed operas based on legends of Parsifal, Tannhäuser, and Lohengrin the Swan Knight. The very name Neuschwanstein means new swan stone, evoking the myth of the Grail Knight and the swan-drawn boat. It would be a castle of symbols, not soldiers. Ludwig did not want to live in a palace. He wanted to inhabit a legend. A castle in the clouds. The design of Neuschwanstein was unlike anything else in Europe at the time. Although inspired by Romanesque and Gothic revival styles, it combined these with dramatic asymmetry. High towers, skybridges, and elaborate balconies meant not for defense, but for visual awe. It was more stage set than fortress, a medieval castle imagined by a romantic soul living in the steam age. The main gateway features a knight's courtyard, flanked by towers. But beyond this, the plan opens into grand halls, vast interior chapels, and multi-story rooms filled with murals depicting scenes from Wagner's operas and Germanic legend. The throne hall, with its Byzantine dome and towering columns, was modeled after a church apse, intended to represent the union of secular and divine authority, though it notably lacked an actual throne, as Ludwig never completed it. Even the bedrooms were ornate. Ludwig's own was designed with intricate wood carvings and a painted ceiling resembling a night sky. Corridors resembled castle battlements but led only to more murals, more motifs, more silence. Isolation by design. Unlike castles of earlier eras, which were built for defense or for courtly life, Neuschwanstein was designed for solitude. Ludwig rarely received visitors. He preferred to live alone, dining at strange hours, often in silence, with only his servants or books for company. He once wrote, "I wish to remain an eternal enigma to myself and to others." Neuschwanstein helped him do just that. High in the mountains, it became his refuge from reality, a place where the conflicts of unification, budgetary concerns, and democratic pressures could not reach him. But they did. The kingdom below. While Ludwig poured resources into his castles, Bavaria changed. In 1871, Germany was unified under Prussian dominance, and Bavaria's sovereignty eroded. Ludwig remained king, but increasingly symbolically. His ministers grew frustrated by his absence from political affairs and his relentless spending on architectural fantasies. By the early 1880s, concern for the king's mental health became official. In 1886, a commission of psychiatrists declared Ludwig unfit to rule, despite never directly examining him. He was deposed on June 10, 1886. 3 days later, he was found dead in the Starnberg Lake, alongside his doctor, in shallow water. The cause of death was never definitively proven. Many believed it was suicide. Others suspected foul play. He was 40 years old. An unfinished masterpiece. When Ludwig died, Neuschwanstein was far from complete. Only about 15 rooms were finished. The rest remained scaffolding and stone. Construction ceased immediately. The vision, the dream, was abruptly paused, its creator gone. And yet, within weeks, the castle was open to paying visitors. Even in death, Ludwig's fantasy had value. Unresolved thought. So as the towers of Neuschwanstein rise into the mist, perched between heaven and earth, ask yourself, is it madness to build a dream into stone? Or is the real madness a world that refuses to dream at all? A castle of interior worlds. Though only partially completed during Ludwig II's lifetime, Neuschwanstein Castle is an unusually complete expression of its creator's inner life. Each chamber is layered in symbolism, not merely decorative but narrative, a kind of biographical theater written in stone, wood, and paint. This was not a castle built around guests, courts, or war councils. It was an escape inward, a monument to artistic solitude. The rooms function more like private sanctuaries than social spaces. Even the immense Singer's Hall, modeled after the Wartburg Castle's legendary performance space, was never used for actual concerts during Ludwig's lifetime. Its purpose was not public celebration, but personal immersion. In these silent halls, Ludwig curated a version of the Middle Ages that had never truly existed, but one he longed to inhabit. Murals as manifesto. Wandering through Neuschwanstein's completed rooms is like turning the pages of a romanticized epic. The castle's artwork forms a carefully structured universe, drawing almost entirely from Germanic legend and Wagnerian opera. Key themes appear repeatedly. Redemption through love. The fall of purity. The loneliness of kingship. The quest for transcendence. The living room, Lohengrin. One of the central rooms, Ludwig's lavish living quarters, is dominated by murals from the legend of Lohengrin. The Swan Knight, a mysterious figure who arrives in a boat pulled by a swan, sent to protect the innocent but forbidden to reveal his identity. Lohengrin is misunderstood, betrayed, and ultimately withdraws, a fate that Ludwig may have seen as eerily autobiographical. The bedroom, Tristan and Isolde. Another room draws heavily on Tristan und Isolde, Wagner's opera about doomed lovers. The room is intensely carved, an almost claustrophobic display of Gothic excess. Here, love and death are bound together in Baroque splendor. The Chapel Parsifal. Near the throne room, murals from Parsifal, the Holy Grail Knight, portray a spiritual quest for purity, healing, and redemption. Ludwig saw in Parsifal not only the heroism of the quest, but the burden of divine expectation. These weren't just stories to Ludwig, they were mirrors. Ludwig's world apart from the world. Ludwig II's relationship with Wagner was, in its early years, close and intense. The king provided financial support that saved the composer from ruin. In return, Wagner gave Ludwig access to a world of myth and music, allowing him to bypass the politics and expectations of modern rule. But their relationship cooled over time. Ludwig was increasingly isolated by design and by circumstance. Ministers found his extravagant spending unsustainable. Citizens, already skeptical of his absences, began to whisper about his eccentric habits, his erratic schedules, and his emotional distance. Ludwig's life became divided between his official role as king and his private identity as dreamer, an identity increasingly lived out in his castles, especially Neuschwanstein. Other mountain palaces. Though Neuschwanstein is the most famous, it was not Ludwig's only alpine endeavor. Linderhof Palace. Nestled in the Graswang Valley, Linderhof was the only palace Ludwig completed. It is much smaller but opulently designed in Rococo style, with formal gardens, cascades, and mirrored halls. Inspired by Louis XIV, it was intended as a retreat, private, theatrical, and intimate. Ludwig frequently stayed at Linderhof, dining alone while mechanized tables delivered his meals, allowing him to avoid servants. Herrenchiemsee. Situated on an island in Lake Chiemsee, this unfinished palace was another ode to Louis XIV. The Hall of Mirrors mimicked Versailles, but few rooms were ever completed. It was too costly, too ambitious, too isolated. These structures, along with Neuschwanstein, formed a triangle of escape not from enemies, but from modernity. Financial controversy and decline. By the early 1880s, Ludwig's debts had grown considerable. Though he funded most of the construction with his private fortune, the scale of his vision far outpaced his means. Neuschwanstein alone cost millions of marks, and it was still unfinished by the time of his death. Ministers, concerned for the financial stability of the monarchy, began documenting Ludwig's expenditures and lobbying for his removal. In 1886, a psychiatric evaluation conducted without direct examination declared Ludwig insane, leading to his forced deposition. The king was arrested and transported to Berg Castle. 3 days later, his body was found in Lake Starnberg, alongside his doctor. Official reports called it suicide, but conspiracy theories endure to this day. The myth after the man. Strangely, Ludwig's death gave life to his vision. Within 6 weeks of his passing, Neuschwanstein was open to the public. Visitors paid to walk the same halls he had filled with solitude. Ironically, the king who had fled the world to build private sanctuaries became more popular in death than in life. Tourism, once an afterthought, became the castle's salvation. Over the next century, Neuschwanstein was preserved, promoted, and eventually enshrined as one of Europe's most iconic landmarks, its silhouette printed on postcards, puzzles, and passports of memory. The Disney effect. In the mid-20th century, Neuschwanstein's influence reached far beyond Bavaria. Walt Disney, while touring Europe in the 1950s, visited the castle and was captivated by its form. When designing Sleeping Beauty's castle for Disneyland, he borrowed heavily from Neuschwanstein's silhouetted soaring towers, pointed spires, and mountaintop perch. Thus, the once private vision of a lonely Bavarian king became a global symbol of fantasy, replicated in theme parks around the world. Ludwig had dreamed of a timeless world, untouched by industrialism. Ironically, his castle became a cultural artifact of industrial-scale tourism. The Stone and the Ghost. Today, walking through Neuschwanstein, one cannot help but feel both awe and absence. The castle is magnificent, yes, but also strangely quiet, even when filled with tourists. Its vast halls remain largely unfurnished. Its upper rooms were never completed. The throne room, the symbolic heart of the structure, still has no throne. It's a building that feels more like a paused story than a concluded one. And perhaps that is why it endures. The enduring appeal of high places. There is something eternal about building castles in the sky. Whether for defense, seclusion, or reverie, humans continue to place their dreams at elevation, as if proximity to the clouds brings us closer to something truer than the world below. For Ludwig II, the mountains were not obstacles. They were escape routes, portals to a world where kings were philosophers, knights were poets, and reality bent to the will of beauty. But the higher you build, the further there is to fall. Unresolved thought. And so, as Neuschwanstein's towers cast long shadows across the Alpine valley below, one wonders, is a dream still real if it ends unfinished, or does its incompletion make it immortal? An incomplete kingdom. When King Ludwig II died in 1886, Neuschwanstein Castle was not only unfinished, it was unsolvable. The plans were incomplete. The vision was personal. The man behind it had never fully explained what he hoped it would become. What remained was a castle without a purpose. No court would ever sit there. No diplomatic papers would ever be signed. No royal heirs would be born in its rooms. And yet, it survives as the most recognizable castle in the world, a symbol not of history, but of longing. Neuschwanstein did not fall to war. It did not crumble with age. It remains not because of political importance, but because it resonates with a far more universal emotion, the desire to retreat into something more beautiful than truth. A castle preserved by tourists. It is one of the more profound ironies of European history that Ludwig's Temple of Solitude was saved by mass visitation. After his death, the Bavarian government, keen to recover some of the king's immense debts, opened the castle to tourists almost immediately. Within decades, Neuschwanstein had become a major economic engine, bringing in visitors, currency, and global interest. During World War II, the castle was even used by the Nazis as a repository for looted art, shielded by its remote location. American forces spared it from bombing raids and occupied it peacefully, returning the art and preventing its destruction. Today, over 1.4 million people visit the castle each year, climbing the narrow roads and hiking the forest paths to photograph its towers, peer into its murals, and stare out from its balconies toward the Hohenschwangau Valley below. It is, in a quiet way, still serving its king, generating income for the people of Bavaria and holding their stories aloft. The inheritance of a vision. While Neuschwanstein is the most famous, it is not alone in Ludwig's architectural legacy. His other residences, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, and the redesigned rooms of Hohenschwangau, remain important testaments to his unique view of kingship and culture. But Neuschwanstein is special. It is the unfinished quality of the castle that gives it depth. The fact that some rooms were never painted, some towers never completed, lends it a feeling of arrested dreaming, a suspended moment in time, like a musical phrase never resolved. Even the grand throne room, modeled after a Byzantine basilica, has no throne. And that absence speaks louder than any opulence. It tells us this was never a place for governing. It was a place for imagining. The madness of majesty. To this day, debate continues about Ludwig's mental state. Was he truly insane? Or was he simply an artist born into a political machine, a soul better suited to solitude than parliament? He was certainly eccentric. He slept during the day and wandered his castles at night. He demanded elaborate theatrical productions for an audience of one. He built elaborate table elevators and mechanical swan boats. He wrote letters to composers and monarchs, full of florid symbolism and abstract declarations. But none of these behaviors, on their own, confirm madness. Some historians argue he was simply introverted, romantic, and highly sensitive, a poor fit for the age of Prussian militarism and Bismarckian realpolitik. The question, perhaps, is not whether Ludwig was mad, but whether the modern world was too narrow to contain a king like him. Castles as mirrors. All castles reflect the priorities of the age in which they were built. Masada showed us desperation and defiance. Montségur revealed persecution and martyrdom. Castle Koch offered an aesthetic resistance to industrial modernity. But Neuschwanstein stands apart. It is not a monument to conflict or even history, it is a monument to emotion, to longing, to the tension between dream and duty, art and governance, solitude and sovereignty. Its walls are not haunted by the ghosts of war, but by the quiet weight of expectation. The myth that grew. In the century after his death, Ludwig II has become known as the fairy tale king. Books, films, operas, and even ballets have been based on his life. He has been portrayed as a tragic figure, a visionary, a recluse, and sometimes a saint of misunderstood beauty. His sexuality, his faith, and his creative ambitions are often speculated upon, but always with the air of mystery. He remains an enigma. And Neuschwanstein is his cathedral. Like the Swan Knight he so admired, Ludwig came and went under uncertain skies, never fully revealing himself. His castle, perched in the clouds, seems less like a building and more like a pause in the landscape, a place where time slowed down long enough for one person's vision to become everyone's. The role of the mountains. No castle like Neuschwanstein could exist on the lowland plains. The Alps, with their isolation, silence, and grandeur, were essential to the experience. The air is thinner, the sounds are fewer, the human footprint is smaller. All this allows the castle to become enormous not just in scale, but in emotional resonance. To ascend the road toward Neuschwanstein is to move not just through space, but through sensibility, leaving behind utility and entering into myth. This is what Ludwig understood, perhaps better than any architect or minister. Place matters. And to build at altitude is to say something not just about yourself, but about what you believe matters most. Modern echoes. In an age of data, concrete, and functionality, Neuschwanstein remains deliberately useless and therefore profoundly needed. Its soaring spires, its painted halls, and its hidden passages invite a kind of reverence not because they serve a clear function, but because they don't. They offer us the chance to ask different questions. What is beauty if not useful? What is a dream if it cannot be finished? Can a building contain longing? Neuschwanstein answers these questions not with words, but with presence. It simply stands there above the pines, daring us to feel something old and inconvenient, wonder. Final reflection. So as the clouds pass across its towers, and the valleys darken into evening, we are left with one final thought. Perhaps the greatest castles are not those that conquered the world, but those that showed us the world we secretly wish could be real.